Hey guys, tonight we're drifting off to 15th century Tenochtitlan, where the air is thick with the perfume of 100,000 blossoms, and the canals shimmer like liquid obsidian under the midday sun. You step off your canoe onto a wooden plank, sandals squelching in the rich mud of the lake's edge, and immediately a vendor thrusts a garland of marigolds around your neck. For luck, he insists, though you suspect it's just to empty your pouch of cacao beans. The city hums, not with the harsh clatter of modern life, but with the low murmur of bartering, the rhythmic slap of tortilla dough, and somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable sound of a priest scolding someone for bringing the wrong kind of lilies to a sacrifice. You probably wouldn't last a day here, by the way. Not because of the occasional human sacrifice, though, yikes, but because you'd absolutely insult some noble by accidentally offering wilted flowers, and suddenly you're hauling rocks for a pyramid. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I love imagining you all tucked in from Tokyo to Toronto, half asleep but still vaguely curious about why Aztecs were so obsessed with flowers that they basically turned their capital into a botanical love letter. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice, after the assault of floral perfumes, is the water. Tenochtitlan shouldn't exist. It's a city built on a lake, a maze of canals and causeways where gondolas piled with avocados, jade, and yes, more flowers, glide past like it's no big deal. The Aztecs didn't just adapt to this swampy nightmare, they perfected it. Their secret? Chinampas, floating gardens so fertile they could harvest 7 crops a year, while Europe was still praying their wheat wouldn't rot. Historians still argue whether chinampas were truly floating, or just really well-drained mud islands, but either way, they're the reason your sandals keep sinking. You pass a gardener waist-deep in the muck, carefully layering mud, reeds, and decaying plants like some kind of Mesoamerican lasagna. He scowls when you ask if it smells. Like money, he grumbles. And he's not wrong, these plots grew enough food to feed a city of 200,000, with leftovers to fling at ungrateful gods. Here's a fun fact, the Aztecs were the first civilization to use companion planting, stacking corn, beans, and squash together like a tiny agricultural superhero team. The corn stalks gave beans a ladder, the beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, though they obviously didn't call it that, and the squash leaves shaded out weeds. Meanwhile, in Europe, farmers were still just throwing seeds at dirt and hoping for the best. But the real kicker? These gardens weren't just practical, they were political. The more flowers you grew, the closer you were to the gods. And the gods, as it turns out, had opinions. Take Xochiquetzal, goddess of love, who supposedly demanded a fresh garland of Yloxochitl, heart flowers, every morning, or she'd curse your love life. Imagine explaining to your spouse that your marriage is failing because you skimped on the floral budget, the floating gardens. As you wade deeper into the chinampas, the mud sucking at your ankles like a reluctant apology, you realize these aren't just gardens, they're feats of engineering that would make modern urban planners weep into their blueprints. Each rectangular plot stretches about 30 feet long, anchored by willow trees whose roots knit together underwater like stubborn old friends refusing to let go. The gardeners here move with the quiet precision of surgeons, their hands calloused from years of weaving reeds into living fences that keep the precious soil from washing away. You watch as one worker, his back glistening in the humid air, plunges a digging stick into the shallow water and comes up with a clump of dark, rich earth. Lake bottom gold, he murmurs, and you suddenly understand why the Aztecs called this place the navel of the world. The mud here isn't just dirt, it's centuries of decayed plants and fish waste, a natural fertilizer so potent that modern scientists still can't quite replicate its perfect nutrient balance. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs discovered this technique by accident or through careful observation, but either way, they turned a swamp into the most productive agricultural system of the ancient Americas. Here's something that'll make you chuckle, these gardeners had their own version of crop rotation, except instead of fields, they rotated entire garden beds. When one chinampa became exhausted, which took years, unlike European fields that gave up after a season or two, they'd simply untie it from its moorings, let it float downstream to rest, and replace it with a fresh one. It's like nature's conveyor belt, if conveyor belts were made of reeds and smelled vaguely of fish. The real magic happens at the edges of these floating plots, where flowers grow in such profusion that the water itself seems to blush. This isn't just decoration, it's practical botany at its finest. The bright petals attract pollinators while their roots filter the water, creating a self-cleaning system that puts modern water treatment plants to shame. You pluck a stray blossom from the water's surface, its petals the color of a sunset, and the gardener beside you gasps. "That's a noble's flower," he hisses. "One of those in your hand could buy you a week's worth of corn." You drop it like it's on fire. Speaking of value, here's a quirky tidbit: the most prized flowers weren't necessarily the rarest or most beautiful, but the ones that lasted longest after being cut. Gardeners would compete to develop varieties that could survive days out of water, their secret techniques passed down like sacred texts. Some even claimed to have flowers that never wilted, though those usually turned out to be clever fakes made of feathers and dyed glue. As the sun begins its slow descent, painting the canals in shades of liquid gold, you notice something peculiar: the gardens seem to sigh. It's not just the wind through the reeds, but an actual audible release of breath as flowers close their petals for the night. The gardeners pause in their work, murmuring quiet words of thanks to the earth. One old man with skin like weathered leather catches your questioning look. "They're not just plants," he says simply. "They're the earth's way of talking back." And in that moment, standing knee-deep in warm water surrounded by whispering blossoms, you almost believe him, flowers that speak. As twilight settles over Tenochtitlan, you begin to understand why the Aztecs believed flowers had voices. The marketplace may have closed, but the air still thrums with unspoken messages carried on petals. A crushed gardenia left on a doorstep isn't just debris, it's a carefully coded insult from a jilted lover. A single marigold tucked behind a merchant's ear? That's today's exchange rate for cacao beans. You watch as a young girl skips past, trailing a chain of hibiscus flowers behind her like a living signature, her family's floral crest announcing their presence in this neighborhood. The language of flowers here isn't just poetry, it's bureaucracy in bloom. Every government official carries a specific blossom that serves as both identification and rank insignia. You spot a tax collector whose elaborate headdress of purple orchids makes him look like a walking bouquet, until you notice the sharp obsidian blade tucked beneath his arm, proof that flower power could be literal in Aztec society. Historians still argue whether this floral code system was more complex than the written language itself, but one thing's certain: misidentifying someone's status flower could get you fined, or worse, forced to listen to their entire family lineage. Here's a fact that'll make modern florists weep: Aztec flower arrangements followed strict grammatical rules. A bouquet wasn't just pretty colors thrown together, it was a sentence with nouns, large central flowers, verbs, trailing vines that suggested action, and even adjectives, small accent blooms. The most skilled florists were considered wordsmiths, their creations capable of conveying everything from marriage proposals to declarations of war. Imagine having to parse whether that bouquet at your door means, "I love you," or "Your army will fall by dawn," based solely on how the gardenias are tilted. But the real showstopper comes when you witness a flower trial. Yes, you heard right, disputes could be settled by floral combat. Two parties would present elaborate arrangements to a judge, who would determine the winner based on both botanical merit and symbolic meaning. The losers' flowers would be ceremonially burned while the victors were displayed in the temple for a full cycle of the moon. You can't help but wonder how many marital disputes were solved by particularly passive-aggressive petunias. As night falls completely, the floral whispers grow louder. A passing noble's perfume, extracted from thousands of carefully distilled blossoms, tells you his family controls the vanilla trade before he even opens his mouth. A discarded wreath of withered stems at the temple step speaks volumes about some failed petition to the gods. And that single, perfect rose floating in the palace fountain? That's not an accident, it's a threat from the shadowy flower council, their botanical machinations as carefully cultivated as their prize-winning dahlias, the flower priest's ritual. Dawn finds you crouched behind a carved stone pillar, watching the chief flower priest begin his morning ritual with the kind of precision usually reserved for brain surgeons or pastry chefs. His fingers, stained permanently green from decades of handling stems, move with hypnotic slowness as he arranges exactly 365 petals around a circular stone, one for each day in the solar calendar. You try not to sneeze as pollen drifts through shafts of morning light like golden dust, though the priest's apprentice glares at you anyway. These people take their petals seriously. What looks like simple gardening is actually high-stakes divination. Each flower variety corresponds to a different godly domain: marigolds for the sun god Tonatiuh, poppies for the dream god Xochipilli, and those suspiciously phallic-looking orchids for, well, you can probably guess. The priest murmurs prayers as he works, his voice blending with the drowsy hum of bees drunk on nectar. Historians still argue whether these rituals were purely symbolic or if the Aztecs genuinely believed flowers contained divine voices, but watching the priest's face contort with concentration, you're leaning toward the latter. Here's the quirky part: the priest isn't just reading flowers, he's arguing with them. When a blossom wilts unexpectedly, he scolds it like a misbehaving child. When petals arrange themselves in a perfect spiral, something that supposedly happens naturally about once every 300 arrangements, he bows so deeply his forehead touches the ground. You witness what can only be described as floral couples therapy when he mediates between two clashing blooms destined for the same ceremonial bundle. The gardenia thinks she's better than the magnolia, he explains gravely, as if this explains everything. Mid-morning brings the most bizarre ritual yet, the flower baptism. The priest's assistants haul in baskets of newly picked blossoms which are then purified by being swung through incense smoke while a chorus of children sing off-key botanical hymns. One particularly rebellious lily gets dunked in a ceremonial bath of fermented agave juice, emerging looking significantly more sober than the priest performing the ritual. You make a mental note that hangover cure appears nowhere in the official floral liturgy. As noon approaches, the real work begins, interpreting the emperor's dreams through petal arrangements. Yesterday's nightmare about jaguars made of corn gets translated into an elaborate bouquet featuring maize flowers surrounded by menacing-looking carnations. The priest adds some strategic thorns, for historical accuracy, he insists, before sending it off to the palace with all the gravitas of a military dispatch. You half expect the flowers to salute as they're carried away. Just when you think things can't get stranger, the afternoon brings the weekly flower court, where disputes between gardeners are settled by, and we're not making this up, having the flowers themselves testify. Two rival growers present their best blooms while the priest listens to each plant's story by holding it to his ear like a seashell. The verdict comes when one flower unexpectedly sheds its petals, which everyone interprets as either divine justice or really poor horticultural timing. Either way, someone's paying extra tribute this month. Xochiquetzal's favorite petals. The temple of Xochiquetzal smells like a perfume factory exploded in a sugar cane field, all cloying sweetness with an undercurrent of something suspiciously intoxicating. You press yourself against a carved pillar as a procession of barefoot gardeners shuffle past, their arms trembling under piles of blossoms so pristine they practically glow. These aren't just offerings, they're botanical tributes to the goddess of love, beauty, and, judging by the nervous sweat staining these men's loincloths, terrifyingly specific floral preferences. At the center of the chaos stands the high florist, a woman whose elaborate headdress of intertwined gardenias and hummingbird skulls marks her as the only person in Tenochtitlan brave, or foolish, enough to negotiate directly with the goddess's earthly representatives. She inspects each bouquet with the intensity of a general reviewing troops, occasionally flinging substandard blossoms over her shoulder where they're immediately snatched up by junior priests for quality control testing. Read, personal perfume production. Historians still argue whether Xochiquetzal's famous temper referred to actual divine wrath or just the understandable frustration of underpaid temple staff. Here's the mainstream fact that'll haunt modern gardeners: the goddess demanded fresh flowers every single morning, but only specific varieties picked at precise lunar phases. The morning star, hibiscus, had to be harvested while dew still clung to its petals, the lover's lament, orchids, only after the third night of the new moon. One unfortunate gardener allegedly got turned into a cactus for bringing day-blooming jasmine afternoon. The temple walls are covered in helpful murals depicting exactly which flowers get you blessed versus which get you turned into topiary. Now for the quirky tidbit: the temple maintained a secret flower rehab garden where overworked blossoms were supposedly revived by moonlight baths and whispered poetry. You peek through a vine-covered archway to see a priestess gently massaging rose petals with honeyed fingers while singing what sounds suspiciously like early Aztec blues. Even flowers get heartbreak, she explains without looking up, carefully stitching a split petal with spider silk thread. A nearby tablet records which blooms responded well to therapy: daffodils, versus those that were hopeless cases, those dramatic lilies that wilt if you look at them wrong. The real drama unfolds during the weekly, divine selection ritual, where the goddess's favorite flower is chosen through what amounts to botanical Russian roulette. Priestesses arrange hundreds of blossoms around a golden statue, then wait to see which one gets decapitated first by a hidden obsidian blade. Today's winner is a hapless magnolia that barely had time to enjoy its victory before being woven into the high florist's already overcrowded headdress. The gardeners look relieved; their magnolia groves get a week's reprieve from intensive harvesting. As you're leaving, you spot something that explains all those fainting couches in the temple annex: the emergency backup bouquets. Rows upon rows of preserved flowers float in golden jars of nectar, each labeled with dates and contingency scenarios. One particularly elaborate arrangement bears the label, "In case of unexpected divine visit plus bad hair day." Even goddesses, it seems, understand the importance of a good floral first impression: market day madness. The Tlatelolco flower market hits your senses like a botanical tsunami, a riot of color so intense it makes your eyes water, perfume so thick you can taste them, and at least 3 different vendors shouting poetic couplets about your mother's resemblance to a particularly fresh cactus bloom. You clutch your pouch of cacao beans tighter as a child brushes past, their arms full of garlands that seem to whisper as they move. Everywhere, flowers defy gravity, stacked in pyramids taller than the vendors, woven into floating canopies overhead, even threaded through the beards of particularly dedicated customers. Navigating the stalls requires equal parts strategy and sheer dumb luck. To your left, a woman sells moon maiden blossoms that supposedly glow in darkness. They don't, but the firefly larvae glued to them sort of help. To your right, a blind elder offers truth-telling tulips that make people confess secrets, or just really have to pee. The results are apparently similar. Historians still argue whether these markets functioned more like modern stock exchanges or psychedelic art installations, but watching a merchant weigh jade flowers against bags of butterfly wings, you're leaning toward the latter. Here's a fact that'll revolutionize your next trip to the florist: Aztec flower vendors were required by law to be poets. Each sale had to include an original verse comparing the customer to some flattering botanical feature. You witness a particularly creative merchant describe a warrior's scars as the vines of experience climbing the tree of his valor, before selling him an armful of suspiciously phallic-looking orchids. The warrior leaves blushing but satisfied, proving good marketing transcends centuries. The real action happens at the elite blooms section, where merchants handle flowers with silk gloves and prices are whispered rather than stated aloud. You watch a noblewoman spend 15 minutes inspecting a single emperor's sigh gardenia for imperfections before paying its weight in gold, only for her slave to immediately crush it into perfume right in front of the horrified grower. Nearby, a group of priests engage in what appears to be floral espionage, using hand mirrors to discreetly check if their rivals are buying the same ceremonial blossoms they are. Just when you think the market can't get more surreal, the noon bell rings and the entire marketplace erupts into the daily flower dance. Vendors balance bouquets on their heads while performing intricate steps that supposedly please the flower goddess, and conveniently shake loose petals from less-than-fresh inventory. A particularly enthusiastic merchant near the chili stalls gets carried away and ends up wearing his entire stock of water lilies like some kind of botanical wrestler. no one bats an eye. As the sun dips lower, you learn the dark secret of market economics, the petal mafia. These underground dealers control the supply of rare blossoms through means that involve suspiciously well-fed jaguars and at least one canoe full of bribes. When a merchant suddenly closes his stall after receiving a bouquet of black roses, everyone pretends not to notice. You make a mental note to avoid asking about the floating gardens incident, unless you want to wake up wearing a necklace of poison ivy, royal bouquet drama. The imperial palace's flower chamber smells like a conspiracy. Not the metaphorical kind, the actual, physical scent of plotting. The special, whispering irises, cultivated here release pheromones that make voices carry farther, meaning every arrangement is basically a botanical listening device. You press yourself against a wall carved with floral motifs as a procession of gardeners hurry past, their arms full of blossoms so perfect they look photoshopped. These aren't decorations, they're the botanical equivalent of body armor in Moctezuma's court. At the center of the frenzy stands the royal florist, a man whose feather cloak shimmers with embroidered petals that change color depending on the angle of light, and possibly the mood of the emperor. He's currently engaged in what appears to be floral triage, separating blossoms into piles labeled, worthy of the emperor's left sandal, acceptable for third cousins, and give to the tax collectors and hope they don't notice. Historians still argue whether the famous flower audits were actual quality control or just elaborate power plays, but watching a gardener get demoted to tulip duty for bringing slightly off-center dahlias, you're guessing the latter. Here's the mainstream fact that explains so much. Moctezuma changed his flower crown 3 times daily, each style meticulously coded to send political messages. The morning, dewdrop diadem, fresh-picked blossoms still wet with lake water, signaled approachability. The midday, sun disk coronet, golden flowers arranged in geometric precision, projected authority. And the evening, twilight wreath, fragile night bloomers that wilted before dawn, served as a not-so-subtle reminder of mortality, both the emperor's divine nature and what happened to people who disappointed him. Now for the quirky tidbit, the palace maintained a secret, flower blacklist of blooms banned for political reasons. Today's forbidden specimen sits under glass like a criminal, the rebel rose, a crimson variety that supposedly grew where a dissident noble's blood had fallen. The current gardener explains in hushed tones how its thorns curve left instead of right, making it subversive by nature. You make the mistake of asking what happens if someone accidentally includes one in a bouquet. The sudden appearance of 4 armed guards suggests it's not a career-enhancing move. The real intrigue happens during the daily petal report, where spies disguised as gardeners present intelligence coded in floral arrangements. A slightly wilted lily placed at a 32-degree angle might mean enemy troops were gathering in the east. An unexpected cluster of blue hydrangeas could signal a noble family overstepping their privileges. You watch as Moctezuma's chief advisor examines a seemingly innocent bouquet of marigolds before suddenly ordering the arrest of someone's uncle. No one questions how he reached this conclusion, though you notice the florist quietly pocketing 3 extra cacao beans afterward. As evening falls, you witness the most bizarre ritual yet, the flower memory test. Servants will in yesterday's discarded arrangements, and courtiers must identify each bloom while blindfolded to prove their loyalty, and that they hadn't been drinking too much pulque. One nobleman mixes up his peonies and poppies, resulting in what everyone insists is a hilarious misunderstanding but what definitely gets him reassigned to border patrol duty tomorrow. Just when you think palace life can't get more surreal, the head gardener proudly shows off the imperial flower archive, pressed blossoms documenting every significant event in Aztec history. The page for last year's war shows a delicate white flower stained suspiciously red at the edges. That's not pigment, the gardener whispers. That's actual. He's interrupted by a sudden cascade of petals from the ceiling, the emperor's signal that today's floral audience is over, and everyone should probably stop talking now. Perfume versus politics. The war chamber reeks of roses, a disconcerting contrast to the maps of enemy territories pinned with what you hope are just decorative obsidian daggers. You watch as generals rub scented oils into their leather armor, turning each piece into a brutal bouquet that'll confuse both nostrils and enemies. This isn't vanity, it's biological warfare. The right floral blend could make opposing diplomats more compliant, mask the smell of fear during negotiations, and, if the royal perfumer did his job correctly, possibly induce allergic reactions in particularly sensitive foes. The chief perfumer moves through the room like a walking greenhouse, his layered robes releasing different scents with each step: jasmine for calm, marigold for alertness, and something musky that makes your eyes water involuntarily. He pauses to adjust the flower crown of a young commander, tucking in a few extra violets, for sincerity. Historians still argue whether these floral tactics actually influenced battle outcomes or just gave everyone involved really nice headaches, but looking at the dazed expression of the enemy ambassador currently being smothered in lilac-scented smoke, you're leaning toward the former. Here's the mainstream fact that explains so much: Aztec nobles believed flowers contained the voices of their ancestors. Before important negotiations, they'd literally marinate in petal-infused steam baths for hours, emerging so fragrant that bees followed them around like fuzzy honor guards. The more powerful the noble, the more complex their signature scent. Moctezuma's personal blend allegedly contained 68 different blossoms and one secret ingredient that made anyone who smelled it slightly more suggestible. Modern scholars suspect it was just really good lavender, but the mystery makes for better stories. Now for the quirky tidbit: the military maintained a special corps of flower spies, who could identify enemy alliances by the pollen stains on their sandals. You observe one such specialist examining a captured warrior's cloak under a magnifying crystal, nodding gravely at the telltale orange dust clinging to the fibers. Tlaxcalan agents, he murmurs, pointing to distinctive sunflower pollen that supposedly only grew in their territory. The general immediately orders an attack plan adjustment, proving that sometimes warfare comes down to who has the better botanists. The most bizarre spectacle occurs during the pre-battle flower duel, where opposing commanders exchange increasingly elaborate floral arrangements instead of sword blows. The current challenger presents a wreath of night-blooming cereus, a not-so-subtle suggestion that his enemies should surrender before dark. Your side counters with a bouquet of prickly pear flowers arranged like spears, their golden centers carefully dusted with chili powder. When the enemy commander sneezes violently upon smelling them, your generals take it as a tactical victory and immediately plan the next morning's assault. As tensions escalate, you notice servants quietly replacing all the torches with ones wrapped in scented herbs. The perfumer explains this is the final argument: if negotiations break down completely, they'll burn special flowers that induce uncontrollable yawning in anyone who inhales the smoke. Nothing takes the fight out of warriors like making them want a nap, he whispers, adjusting his blossom-lined mask. You make a mental note to never accept floral gifts from Aztec diplomats. Just when you think the floral warfare can't get more surreal, the night watch arrives wearing garlands of truth flowers that supposedly wilt when someone lies. They look ridiculous until you realize every soldier is carefully keeping their distance from the blossoms, suggesting either extreme honesty or really good poker faces. The captain catches your skeptical look and shrugs. Better than torture, he says, then immediately winces as 3 petals fall from his shoulder wreath, the stinky truth. You follow a trail of crushed marigolds through back alleys of Tenochtitlan, their usually vibrant orange petals turned muddy brown underfoot, until the once fragrant air curdles into something distinctly less poetic. Welcome to the city's underbelly, where flowers don't adorn nobles or temples, but serve as the Aztec equivalent of industrial-strength air fresheners in the least fresh places imaginable. A worker tosses armfuls of wilted blossoms into what can only be described as history's most floral open sewer, their petals forming a deceptively cheerful scum on the surface. Better than the alternative, he grunts, rubbing his nose with a hand that's seen better days. These sanitation gardens aren't just dumping grounds, they're carefully engineered filtration systems where specific flowers break down waste while masking odors. The marigolds you've been trailing? Their natural compounds neutralize ammonia, making them the Febreze of the ancient world. Historians still argue whether this system actually improved public health or just made sewage slightly more Instagram-worthy, but standing downwind when the breeze shifts, you're grateful for whatever help you can get. Here's the mainstream fact that'll change how you see garden centers forever. Aztecs pioneered phytoremediation, using plants to clean contaminated soil, centuries before modern science caught on. Their toilet gardens grew special flowers with roots that absorbed heavy metals, while floating water hyacinths filtered canal waste so effectively that some neighborhoods had cleaner runoff than inflow. The catch? These botanical filters had to be burned monthly, creating ash so toxic that the disposal crews drew hazard pay in the form of not having to pay taxes, and probably not living past 40. Now for the quirky tidbit, the Sanitation Workers Guild had its own floral hierarchy. New recruits started with the relatively pleasant job of harvesting mint for noble latrines, while veterans handled the black blossom shifts, disposing of flowers used in sacrificial ceremonies that were considered spiritually radioactive. The worst assignment? Night blooming remediation, which involved wading waist-deep in moonlit sewage to replace wilted filters, a job so unpleasant the workers developed their own dialect of curses involving creatively combined plant names and bodily functions. The real innovation lies in what locals call the circle of petals. Nothing went to waste. Sewage flowers became fertilizer for medicinal herbs, which in turn fed the bees that pollinated palace gardens, whose discarded blossoms eventually ended up back in the sewers. You watch as a gardener carefully separates slightly used ceremonial flowers from the truly hazardous waste, explaining how temple marigolds get 3 lives, first as divine offerings, then as market decorations, and finally as someone's last line of defense against the smell of 1,000 chamber pots. As you're leaving, hurriedly, you spot the most bizarre sight yet: the odor judges, officials who determine sewage taxes based on how many flowers a household needs to mask their waste. They walk the streets with their noses wrapped in sacred tobacco leaves, rating each residence's scent profile and assigning corresponding floral tribute. One particularly pungent home receives a citation requiring them to plant an entire garden of scented geraniums, while the perfumer next door gets a tax break for making the whole block smell like a goddess's dressing room. Just when you think you've escaped, a worker offers you a visitor's parting gift, a nosegay of overpowering lavender and mint. For the walk back, he says with a grin that suggests you'll need it. You don't argue. The flowers may be slightly used, but as you pass a particularly aromatic fish market, you find yourself clutching them like a life preserver in a sea of ancient urban odors. Flower wars, literally. The battlefield smells suspiciously like a florist's shop after a hurricane, crushed petals mixing with sweat and dirt in a way that would be poetic if not for all the screaming. You duck behind what appears to be a ceremonial topiary shaped like a jaguar, because apparently even warfare requires landscaping here, as another volley of blossom-tipped arrows arcs overhead. This isn't metaphor or pageantry, it's the infamous flowery wars, where city-states settled horticultural disputes through carefully ritualized combat that somehow still managed to get people killed over things like rose pruning techniques. The opposing general stands proudly atop a pyramid of abandoned flower baskets, his armor woven from particularly thorny vines that make hugging him both painful and botanically irresponsible. He's currently delivering what sounds like a declaration of war but is actually just an extremely detailed complaint about stolen orchid cultivars. They took our prize-winning vanilla vine cuttings, his troops roar in response, shaking their petal-studded shields with enough force to create a localized flower storm. Historians still argue whether these wars were primarily about territory, honor, or just really competitive gardening, but watching a warrior get tackled over a disputed magnolia sapling, you're leaning toward option 3. Here's the mainstream fact that explains everything: these conflicts followed strict floral rules. Battles could only be declared during certain blooming seasons, fought on prearranged, challenge fields, that were basically botanical dueling grounds, and paused whenever rare flowers needed pollinating. The infamous Tulip Truce of 1487 lasted 3 whole months because both sides agreed the emperor's prized specimens required undisturbed care. Of course, everyone still cheated. You spot warriors smuggling particularly vicious rose thorns into their cotton armor and what looks suspiciously like genetically modified Venus flytraps being deployed as landmines. Now for the quirky tidbit: the wars had their own bizarre version of fantasy sports. Citizens would place bets not on who would win, but on which flowers would bloom first on the battlefield afterward. Special war gardener units followed the armies, planting quick-growing seeds in blood-enriched soil to settle wagers. The current favorite is a particularly gaudy sunflower hybrid that supposedly grows faster when watered with tears of defeated warriors, though regular water works fine too. The most surreal moment comes during the midday, floral ceasefire, when both sides lay down arms to exchange bouquets and gardening tips. You watch enemy commanders bonding over shared struggles with aphid infestations while their troops trade cuttings like baseball cards. The peace lasts exactly until someone mentions cross-pollination techniques, at which point a priest has to physically separate two horticulturists who might also be generals before they start measuring spear ranges again. As evening falls, the battlefield transforms into an impromptu flower market, with enterprising locals selling petal-based first aid kits and "I survived the War of the Wilting Lilies" commemorative wreaths. A child hands you a slightly dented blossom that looks suspiciously like it was used as a projectile earlier. Press it in a codex, they whisper solemnly, so future generations remember what we fought for. You tuck it away carefully, though you're still not entirely sure whether that was protecting sacred horticultural traditions or just really intense garden variety pettiness. The Singing Gardens. Moonlight transforms the imperial gardens into a silver and shadow dreamscape where flowers don't just grow, they perform. You tiptoe past dozing gardeners, who may or may not be pretending to sleep to avoid explaining why the marigolds are humming in B-flat, until you reach the famous chorus plot. Here, under the watchful gaze of a stone Zoccopili statue, night-blooming cereus flowers tremble as if breathing, their trumpet-shaped petals emitting faint, resonant tones whenever the breeze hits just right. It's not quite music, not quite nature, but something hauntingly in between. The head gardener, who definitely saw you but is choosing to ignore trespassers in favor of his clipboard, makes a notation about which blossoms are in tune tonight. According to temple records, these floral symphonies predict everything from rainfall patterns to imperial marriages, though the predictions only make sense after the fact, like botanical horoscopes. Historians still argue whether the sounds were natural harmonics or cleverly hidden Aeolian flutes installed by mischievous horticulturists, but watching a priestess carefully adjust vine tensions like some ancient sound engineer, you're starting to suspect both explanations might be true. Here's the mainstream fact that'll make you side-eye your houseplants. Aztecs believed certain flowers retained echoes of conversations they'd overheard. The famous echo roses supposedly repeated lovers' whispers when stroked at dawn, while judgment lilies would audibly sigh during court cases if witnesses lied. The current royal florist demonstrates by brushing a moonflower that immediately emits a sound suspiciously like Moctezuma complaining about tribute shortfalls. She covers it quickly, but not before you notice the gardeners exchanging nervous glances. Now for the quirky tidbit. The gardens have their own flower choir schedule posted on an obsidian slab. Morning glories handle dawn vocals, midday harmonies belong to the sun-facing trumpet blossoms, and those eerie midnight notes? That's the controversial corpse flower contingent, whose deep vibrations supposedly comfort wandering spirits but mostly just make everyone slightly nauseous. You catch two apprentices arguing about whether to include a newly discovered base blossom that makes nearby water ripple but also causes temporary blindness if stood too close. The real magic happens during the annual floral concert, when master gardeners arrange blossoms to perform entire mythological tales through scent and sound. Tonight's rehearsal features the creation myth, with marigolds as the sun god's laughter and water lilies providing the splash effects for the birth of the moon. It would be moving if not for the frustrated composer-gardener constantly stopping to scold his lazy orchids for missing their cue again. "You had one job," he mutters, shaking a fertilizer bag like it's musical motivation. As you're leaving, tripping over what sounds suspiciously like a giggling vine, the night watchman shares the garden's darkest secret. Sometimes the flowers sing songs no living person taught them. He claims the Lament of the Fallen City appeared fully formed one evening, its lyrics describing a great calamity years before the Spanish arrived. Before you can ask for details, a particularly aggressive snapdragon, sings, right by your ear in what feels like a botanical dismissal, and suddenly you're very ready to return to the silent, flowerless safety of your bed. A gardener's toolkit. The shed smells like a mad scientist's workshop crossed with a jewelry store, metallic, herbal, and vaguely alarming. You run your finger along a shelf of obsidian blades so sharp they could split a hair lengthwise, and according to the warning glyphs, probably have. This isn't your grandpa's gardening shed, it's a precision instrument lab where every tool serves multiple purposes, from pruning to plant-based espionage. The head groundskeeper eyes you suspiciously as he polishes what appears to be a jade trowel with built-in seed measurement notches. "Break it and you weed the imperial gardens for a year," he says cheerfully. The star of the collection is the flower whisperer, a hollow bone tube that magnifies sap movement sounds so gardeners can diagnose thirsty plants. You press it to a drooping sunflower stem and jump when it emits a distinct groaning noise. "That one's dramatic," the gardener shrugs, "they all groan when the soil's slightly dry." Historians still argue whether these tools represented advanced horticultural science or just really committed placebo effects, but watching a trainee successfully treat blight based solely on what the dahlia's sap rhythm suggests, you're inclined to believe the former. Here's the mainstream fact that'll make you rethink your plastic trowel. Aztec gardeners had specialized tools for every part of the plant's life cycle. The birth needles, hummingbird femur splinters, transplanted seedlings with surgical precision. The adolescence combs, jaguar claw replicas, trained vines to grow in sacred geometric patterns. And the infamous death hooks, obsidian curved blades, harvested blossoms so cleanly they supposedly didn't realize they'd been cut for hours. You test one on a marigold and swear the flower takes a full minute before wilting, though that might just be the sleep deprivation talking. Now for the quirky tidbit: the most prized tool isn't a tool at all, but a living assistant, trained nectar bats on silk leashes. You watch a gardener direct his bat to pollinate specific blossoms using a series of tongue clicks that translate roughly to, "Not that one, you glutton," the royal orchids. The bats work for payment in fermented mango juice, becoming increasingly sloppy as their shift progresses. One particularly intoxicated specimen keeps missing flowers and hugging the gardener's head instead. The real engineering marvel is the rain calculator, a series of interconnected gourds that track humidity, soil saturation, and, if you believe the inscriptions, plant emotional states. The current groundskeeper demonstrates by pouring water into the main chamber, which triggers carved flowers to pop up at varying heights. "The lilies are pessimistic this week," he notes, pointing to their perpetually drooping stone petals. A junior gardener whispers that last month it predicted a drought that turned out to just be someone forgetting to close the irrigation sluice. As you're leaving, you spot the forbidden tools, the ones labeled "for Zakiketzel's florists only." Through a crack in the storage box, you glimpse golden tweezers for plucking individual pollen grains, a magnifying lens made from perfectly clear quartz, and what looks suspiciously like a petal stretching device that explains how temple flowers always appear impossibly large. The groundskeeper slams the lid shut with a glare that suggests questions are inadvisable. His pruning knife, you notice, is already in his other hand, the chocolate flower scandal. The alley smells like a decadent crime scene, rich cocoa undertones cut with the sharp tang of fear sweat. You press against a wall plastered with faded flower posters as a hooded figure slips past, their basket emitting the distinctive floral citrus perfume of fresh cocoa blossoms. These waxy white flowers are technically illegal to sell, each one represents a potential cocoa pod that could have been imperial tribute, but here they are, changing hands for enough cacao beans to feed a family for a month. Your guide, a former temple florist turned informant, whispers that the black market's latest trick is disguising the blooms as common magnolias using clever petal folds and strategic pollen dusting. "The magistrates only catch the dumb ones," he mutters, eyeing a suspiciously perfect magnolia in a passing merchant's hair. The real action happens at the honey drop-in, where the backroom hosts blind taste tests of chocolate flower infusions. Wealthy merchants sip from delicate cups, bidding on which blossoms will produce next season's finest cocoa based solely on their aromatic profiles. One particularly enthusiastic bidder just paid 6 quetzal feathers for a single sip of an infusion that supposedly tastes like victory and tax evasion. Historians still argue whether this clandestine trade significantly impacted cocoa production or just gave nobles an exciting way to waste resources, but watching a magistrate's wife discreetly pocket 3 blossoms while loudly condemning the practice, you're guessing both. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the obsession. Cocoa flowers were the Aztec equivalent of insider trading tips. Since only about 3 out of every 1,000 blossoms mature into cocoa pods, predicting which ones would fruit was like botanical stock picking. The royal gardeners had developed a 27-point inspection system involving ant behavior and petal tension measurements, but the black market claimed a simple sniff test could predict success with 80% accuracy, a statistic that suspiciously rounded up from 62%. Now for the quirky tidbit. The most sought-after blossoms aren't the ones that produce the best chocolate, but the dud flowers that fail to fruit. These virgin blooms became status symbols because their concentrated nectar created an intensely floral tea that supposedly granted visions. You witness a shaman pay an outrageous sum for what looks like an ordinary wilted blossom, only for him to carefully extract a single drop of nectar he claims contains the voice of Tlaloc. It smells suspiciously like fermented mango to you, but who are you to question divine intervention? The real scandal erupts when the imperial taste tester arrives incognito. His gold nose ring and jade-encrusted tasting spoon aren't fooling anyone. He samples 3 infusions before suddenly declaring one batch identical to the emperor's private reserve. The room explodes in accusations. Someone's been stealing royal garden clippings. As arguments escalate into a full-blown petal-throwing fight, your guide drags you out past a suspiciously familiar-looking gardener from Section 12 who's suddenly wearing much nicer clothes than he should afford, droughts and divine tantrums. The earth cracks like a broken cocoa pod under your sandals as you trek through what was once the empire's most fertile Chinampa. Now, the canals are ghostly outlines in the dust, and sun-bleached fish skeletons cling to the reeds like macabre decorations. A gardener kneels in the parched soil, not planting, but pleading, rubbing copal resin into the stems of his withering cornflowers while whispering what sounds like a floral apology letter to Tlaloc. He wants jade, not tears, his assistant mutters, tossing another useless bucket of well water onto soil that drinks it like a drunkard gulps pulque. This isn't just bad weather, it's a full-blown divine sulk, and the entire agricultural system is paying the price. The temple's response? A voluntary flour tax that somehow extracted even from farmers whose fields resemble toasted tortillas. Priests move through the marketplace with baskets, collecting rain bribes of the most fragrant blossoms, though you notice the offerings mysteriously end up as temple decor rather than sacrificial pyre fuel. Historians still argue whether these droughts were natural cycles or the result of that time Moctezuma accidentally wore Tlaloc's signature water lilies as a belt accessory, but watching a priest nervously edge away from a particularly dark rain cloud, you suspect the latter. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals Aztec ingenuity. Their irrigation systems included thirst alarms, clay pots buried upside down that made a distinctive gurgling noise when groundwater dropped too low. You watch a farmer press his ear to one now, his face falling at the silence. Last time it was this dry, he says, we had to invent new types of flowers that could grow on complaints alone. Now for the quirky tidbit, the gardener's secret weapon isn't technology, but psychology. They've developed rain trick flowers that mimic the appearance of water-drenched blooms through clever petal textures and light refraction. As you examine one, its leaves actually feel damp to the touch, until you realize it's just sap carefully applied to fool both gods and customers. The head gardener winks as he demonstrates how to brush morning dew onto fake rain beads that'll convince nervous nobles their gardens are still blessed. If the gods won't send water, he shrugs, we'll fake it until they feel guilty. The real action happens at the emergency breeding plots, where botanists race to develop drought-resistant strains by crossing tough desert cacti with delicate ornamentals. The results are unsettling. A flower with thorns that secrete water. A lily that blooms inside its own bulb to retain moisture. And the infamous walking marigold, whose roots slowly retract from parched soil, leaving a trail that gardeners interpret like botanical tea leaves. One particularly desperate grower shows you his last resort project, training vines to form living pipes between healthier fields. They keep trying to flower instead, because even plants here have artistic ambitions. As dusk falls, you spot the most bizarre ritual yet, the reverse rain dance. Instead of summoning storms, gardeners carefully avoid looking at the sky while ostentatiously enjoying the drought, sipping precious water in front of rain gauges, laughing too loudly about how nice the dust storms are. It's reverse psychology for deities, and judging by the thunder rumbling in the distance, either it's working or Tlaloc finds they're acting as insulting as you do, the parrot pollinators. The imperial aviary sounds like a botanical crime scene in progress, squawking, flapping, and the occasional thud of a half-eaten fruit hitting the ground. You duck as a military green parrot swoops past, its beak dripping with stolen nectar and what looks suspiciously like the remains of a prize-winning orchid's reproductive organs. This isn't just a bird enclosure, it's the Aztec Empire's most controversial agricultural experiment, where trained parrots serve as pollinators because the native bees lack floral dedication, won't work for mango bribes. The head trainer, his arms crosshatched with beak marks, gives you a weary look. They're artists, he sighs, as one artist gleefully uproots a seedling to use as a hairpiece. The system is simple in theory: parrots love nectar, flowers need pollen moved, and with careful training, the former could solve the latter. In practice, you watch a scarlet macaw stuff its face with ceremonial marigold stamens, then sneeze the precious pollen all over a gardener's freshly washed hair. Historians still argue whether this project failed because of biology, parrots groom away pollen, or personality, the birds unionized for better treats, but the current success rate, about 1 in 20 flowers actually pollinated, suggests the Aztecs might have been better off just waiting for wind. Here's the mainstream fact that explains this fiasco: Aztecs noticed certain parrot species had pollen-sticky foreheads after feeding, especially the now-extinct emerald drinker parrot. The logical leap? Train entire flocks to methodically visit specific flowers. The reality? You witness a trainee bird meticulously rub its pollen-dusted face clean on the emperor's prized tapestry moments before a palace official arrives for inspection. Now for the quirky tidbit: the birds developed their own illicit economy. A particularly clever blue-crowned parrot has learned to hoard pollen as bargaining chips, trading it back to desperate gardeners for extra fruit. Another only pollinates flowers arranged in patterns that resemble its own face. The head trainer shows you the rogue gallery, sketches of birds banned from the program, one that taught others to fake pollen collection by rolling in dirt, another that developed a signature move where it ate the flower and the reward fruit simultaneously. The real chaos erupts during the weekly pollination reviews, where gardeners present their results to increasingly despondent officials. Today's showcase features a single successfully pollinated sunflower surrounded by 20 trampled seedlings and what looks like a parrot's feather crown made from stolen petals. Progress, the official declares weekly, as a bird in the background loudly mimics the sound of a failing grade. As you leave, the head trainer whispers the program's dirtiest secret: the parrots are terrible at pollination, but their antics increased flower production anyway. Turns out, plants stressed by constant avian harassment bloom more frequently. We pretend it's the pollen transfer, he confesses, watching a parrot use a lily as a wrestling opponent. Really, we're just bullying the flowers into productivity. Night blooming secrets. Moonlight transforms the sacred garden into a silvered puzzle of shadows and sudden, luminous blooms. You freeze mid-step as a night guard raises a finger to his lips, not for silence, but because the moon maiden flowers about to unfurl are notoriously shy. Around you, barefoot harvesters kneel with obsidian knives strapped to their thighs and baskets lined with bat fur, the only material that won't offend the petal's dignity. This isn't gardening, it's floral espionage, where blossoms worth their weight in jade open for mere minutes before retreating into secrecy. A trainee exhales too loudly, causing 3 buds to snap shut with audible pops. The head harvester's glare could wilt cactus spines. These nocturnal blooms aren't just rare, they're legally restricted. The famous ghost orchid can only be picked by left-handed virgins during lunar eclipses, while the widow's kiss requires harvesters to recite their entire family lineage backwards. Why the fuss? Because their properties defy explanation. One drop of moonflower nectar supposedly reveals a lover's infidelity, while the star vine petals induce prophetic dreams, or just really vivid indigestion. Historians still argue whether these restrictions preserved mystical properties or just drove up black market prices, but watching a priestess weigh a single petal against a stack of cocoa beans, you're leaning toward both. Here's the mainstream fact that'll haunt your next moonlight walk. Aztecs believed night flowers were literal pieces of fallen stars, which explains why they're the only plants that thrive without earthly water. The current gardener demonstrates by refusing to irrigate a particularly vibrant patch, instead watering them with reflected moonlight captured in polished silver bowls. The flowers do look suspiciously radiant, though this might just be sleep deprivation and wishful thinking. Now for the quirky tidbit. The harvesters have developed an entire silent language of gestures to avoid startling their quarry. You watch as one makes a series of intricate hand movements to colleagues that roughly translate to, "That one's a diva," approach from the northeast while pretending you don't care. Another blossom requires harvesters to hum at precisely 432 Hz, the plant frequency, while cutting, which sounds lovely until three people attempt it simultaneously and create a dissonance that makes the entire flower bed shudder. The real magic happens at the midnight market, where these blooms are sold under heavy cloaks to nobles who've stayed up way past their bedtimes. A particularly desperate merchant shows you his moon wine, 1 part nectar to 9 parts wishful thinking, that promises to reveal your soulmate's face. It mostly just makes everything taste purple for 6 hours. Another offers dream sachets of petals that allegedly rearrange themselves to answer questions overnight. You buy one, for research, obviously, and it forms what looks either like a profound spiritual symbol or a lopsided rabbit. As dawn threatens, the head gardener performs the closing ritual, blowing sacred tobacco smoke over the remaining buds to put them to sleep. One rebellious flower keeps peeking open, its petals quivering with what seems like laughter, until he finally covers it with a tiny woven blanket. Some blossoms, he sighs, just want to watch the world burn. Floral tax collectors. The imperial counting house smells like a library crossed with a funeral parlor. Dried petals pressed between ledger pages release ghostly perfumes with every turned leaf. You watch as a scribe weighs a pile of marigold petals against copper weights, his face the picture of bureaucratic solemnity while assessing whether this month's tribute from Xochimilco meets the minimum aromatic density standards. Nearby, an appraiser sniffs a jasmine bouquet like a sommelier evaluating wine, declaring it a passable vintage, if lacking in terroir. This isn't bookkeeping, it's horticultural forensics, where every faded blossom tells a story of agricultural fortunes and creative tax evasion. The system is deceptively complex. Flowers aren't just currency here, but living balance sheets. The famous petal purity laws require at least 17% of tribute flowers to be first-day blooms, while stem length regulations ensure nobles can't pawn off their garden's rejects. You witness a merchant argue that his slightly wilted lilies should count double because they're artistically melancholic, until the tax priest produces a magnifying glass and points out telltale teeth marks suggesting parrot pollinators got to them first. Historians still argue whether these floral audits were genuine economic policy or just elaborate performance art, but watching an accountant dismember a sunflower to count its individual seeds for tribute assessment, you're inclined to believe both. Here's the mainstream fact that'll change how you view IRS audits. The empire maintained scent archives, libraries of preserved blossoms against which all tribute flowers were compared. The current archivist shows you shelf after shelf of blossoms floating in amber liquid, each labeled with its origin year and ideal nose wrinkle response. The 1486 crop was particularly bold, he sniffs, holding up a vial that makes your eyes water at 3 paces. Almost defiant. Now for the quirky tidbit. The tax collectors have developed an entire pseudoscience around bloom guilt. They claim certain flowers wilt faster when used to hide wealth, leading to interrogation techniques involving humidors and sudden loud noises. You watch as one inspector questions a suspiciously lightweight bouquet by subjecting it to alternating blasts of incense and cold air while reciting tax law. When 3 petals fall prematurely, his assistant nods gravely and makes a notation that translates roughly to "guilty as charged." The real drama unfolds during the annual, floral census, when every blossom in the empire theoretically gets counted. In practice, it's a week-long festival of creative accounting where gardeners hide prize flowers in fake compost heaps, nobles temporarily gift their best specimens to temples, and at least one creative soul tries to pass off stained glass replicas as the real thing. The current high priest surveys the chaos while sipping what's labeled tribute verification tea, but smells suspiciously like spiked hibiscus. If we actually counted every petal, he confides, we'd have to admit half the empire is growing weeds. As you leave, a junior scribe slips you a pressed flower, the imperial emblem with an extra petal secretly glued on. For your records, he whispers. You tuck it away carefully, though you're not entirely sure whether it's a souvenir or you've just unknowingly participated in botanical tax fraud, the dandelion conspiracy. The missionary's garden looks like it's being invaded. Tiny yellow heads erupt between pious rows of old-world roses and lilies, their jagged leaves splaying like green daggers in the dirt. You watch as a friar frantically uproots one, only for 3 more to appear overnight in defiant clusters. These aren't just weeds to the Spanish, they're botanical insurgents, nicknamed the devil's coins, for how their seeds spread like unwanted currency. The head gardener, his European herbs losing ground by the hour, mutters darkly about indigenous retaliation as he pours boiling water on a particularly robust specimen that simply winks back with another bloom. What the invaders don't understand is that the humble axolotl, dandelion, is sacred here, a resilient survivor whose roots run deeper than any colonial edict. Aztec herbalists secretly cultivated in remedy gardens, using every part from bitter leaves, for digestion, to milky sap, for waterproofing cloaks. Historians still argue whether its rapid spread post-conquest was natural or a quiet act of resistance, but watching a group of children accidentally blow dandelion puffs into a Spanish vegetable plot, you're pretty sure you've spotted history's most passive-aggressive revolution. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the friar's panic. Dandelions appeared in Aztec prophecies as sun markers that would return during times of upheaval. Their sudden prevalence after 1521 had locals nodding knowingly while Spaniards misinterpreted their symbolism as literal witchcraft. You glimpse a confiscated codex where missionaries meticulously painted crosses over every depicted dandelion, missing the irony that the plant's Latin name, Taraxacum officinale, essentially means official remedy for chaos. Now for the quirky tidbit, the weed became underground currency. You witness a healer trade a basket of dandelion roots for information about imprisoned nobles, while a farmer bribes a corrupt official with special honey that's 80% dandelion pollen. The friars try banning it, then taxing it, then rebranding it as Spanish goldflower, but the more they protest, the more the locals cultivate it in hidden patches labeled for donkey feed only. The real showdown happens at the weekly market, where a Franciscan monk delivers an impassioned sermon against the godless weed, only for an elderly Nahua woman to calmly pluck one from his robe's hem and brew it into tea for his indigestion. As he reluctantly sips the effective remedy, the crowd's suppressed smile suggests this battle was lost before it began. You pocket a seed head as you leave, not as rebellion, but as a reminder that some forces can't be contained by borders or beliefs. Bride's bouquet blues. The wedding plaza thrums with tension disguised as celebration, not because the groom is late, though he is, or because the bride's father is drunk, though he definitely is, but because everyone's staring at the ceremonial bouquet trembling in the priest's hands. Its flowers were carefully selected to predict marital success, gardenias for passion, magnolias for longevity, and a single, truth-teller, orchid that supposedly changes color if either partner has, let's say, unshared histories. You watch as the orchid remains stubbornly purple while the groom sweats through his ceremonial paint. The priest clears his throat and subtly rotates the bouquet to better sunlight. This floral forecasting isn't just tradition, it's big business. Dowry negotiations stall until the bride's luck blossoms are evaluated by temple florists who charge extra for favorable interpretations. One such expert now circles the couple, sniffing the air around them and occasionally tossing petals at their feet to see how they land. The cosmos are undecided, he murmurs, conveniently ignoring that the cosmos currently consists of a dove that just defecated on the wedding canopy. Historians still argue whether these predictions held any weight or just became self-fulfilling prophecies, but watching the bride's mother quietly replace a wilting peony when no one's looking, you suspect the latter. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the obsession. Aztec weddings required triple verification, flowers that matched the couple's birth calendars, their parents' approval, and the current god's moods. The current priest consults a floral codex that maps blossom meanings with the same gravity as a military general reviewing battle plans. No lilies today, he declares. Xochiquetzal is menstruating. No one questions this. Now for the quirky tidbit, the real drama unfolds at the flower stomp ritual. The couple must trample a wreath while holding hands, and whichever blooms survive predict their future. Today's pair struggles through unusually tough vines until the groom accidentally elbows a particularly resilient magnolia into the mud. His new mother-in-law's glare could wither cactus fruit, but the florist quickly declares the remaining crushed violets symbolize humble beginnings, which is florist code for this won't last the year. The reception features the infamous drunken bouquet toss, where unwed guests scramble for blossoms that supposedly reveal their own romantic futures. A warrior catches the Phalaenopsis orchid and preens until someone points out it symbolizes fleeting passions. His rival gets the eternal love lotus, which immediately disintegrates in his hands because it was a poorly preserved temple cast-off. As arguments escalate into a petal-throwing brawl, the bride and groom sneak away, their first successful collaboration, the floating orchid heist. Moctezuma's private garden smells like violated sanctity, shattered clay pots, trampled herbs, and the lingering musk of a thief who definitely didn't bathe before committing floral treason. You trace a finger along the broken stems of what were, until last night, the empire's rarest orchids, the legendary jade tears variety that bloomed only during solar eclipses. The head gardener hyperventilates into a ceremonial vase while a priest interprets the crime scene's petals like tea leaves. They took only the left-facing blossoms, he gasps. This was no ordinary thief, they knew the flower's souls. The missing orchids aren't just plants, they're living art. Each blossom supposedly contained a drop of water from the first rain after creation, making them the horticultural equivalent of crown jewels. The guard's initial suspect? A disgruntled royal florist who'd been demoted to composting duty after suggesting the emperor's favorite flower crown lacked structural integrity. He's currently being questioned via an impromptu allergy test involving suspicious pollen and no handkerchief. Historians still argue whether the heist actually happened or was invented to cover up an embarrassing horticultural failure, but the freshly dug tunnel under the garden wall suggests someone went to outrageous lengths for some fancy flowers. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the uproar: these orchids were diplomatic tools. Moctezuma gifted single blossoms to allied rulers as the ultimate flex, living proof that his gardens defied nature itself. Losing 20 at once isn't just theft, it's an act of geopolitical sabotage. The current investigator shows you a coded ledger tracking each orchid's mood based on petal angles, which somehow proves the stolen ones were the most charismatic of the collection. Now for the quirky tidbit: the prime suspect is a flower-loving noblewoman who'd been banned from the gardens after over-enthusiastic pollination attempts. Her estate's sudden redecorating with rare orchid motifs seems suspicious, but the investigation hits a snag when the priests realize no law explicitly forbids floral theft because, and we quote, "what kind of monster would?" The breakthrough comes via an unlikely source: the palace's parrot pollinators. One bird keeps repeating, "pretty in the boat," and dropping orchid fibers. Guards eventually track the scent of stolen blossoms to a floating greenhouse disguised as a fishing vessel, where the thief, a rival city-state's master gardener, is caught mid-transplant, whispering sweet nothings to his kidnapped blooms. His defense? They weren't happy here. The resulting trial features flower witnesses, their vitality assessed as truth-telling, a jury of herbalists, and a sentence involving tending cacti without gloves. As you leave, a single recovered orchid blooms defiantly in its broken pot, because of course the plants have the last word. Flower-based forensics. The marketplace tribunal smells like a perfumer's nightmare. Piles of crushed petals exude competing scents as a judge sniffs each like a bloodhound tracking clues. You watch as a merchant accused of shortchanging customers is made to walk barefoot over a bed of particularly prickly blossoms. His yelp when stepping on a truth-telling thistle is taken as a confession. Nearby, a sobbing child clutches a half-eaten chocolate flower while a priest examines the bite marks in its petals to identify the thief. Spoiler, it was the kid's own uncle. This isn't justice, it's botanical arbitration, where plants don't lie, though they might exaggerate. The system relies on petal forensics, an elaborate pseudoscience where everything from pollen distribution to wilt patterns can indicate guilt. The current case involves a disputed jade blossom sale. Both parties claim ownership, so the high judge orders the flower itself to testify by floating it in sacred spring water. If it drifts east, the seller wins, west favors the buyer. Everyone ignores how the judge's assistant accidentally breathes on the water's surface at the crucial moment. Historians still argue whether these methods produced fair outcomes or just really creative ways to justify biases, but watching a thief spontaneously confess after being handed a cursed marigold, you suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the logic. Aztecs believed flowers retained energy from everyone who touched them, making them natural truth recorders. The judge demonstrates by rubbing a petal against a suspect's wrist, then holding it to a flame. If it pops loudly, the gods are displeased. Today's defendant nearly faints when his test petal explodes like festival fireworks, though this might just be because the petal was actually a dried chili in disguise. Now for the quirky tidbit. The market employs professional flower whisperers who interpret petal patterns like ancient QR codes. One such expert squints at a trampled gardenia, declaring its creases prove the theft occurred during the hour of the rabbit by someone with a slight limp. Amazingly, this leads directly to the culprit, a sandal maker whose bad knee is legendary. When confronted, he produces an alibi bouquet that supposedly bloomed at his home during the crime, until someone points out the flowers are upside down in their vase, a classic rookie forgery mistake. The real drama unfolds during the trial by bouquet, where accuser and accused must assemble competing floral arrangements to plead their cases. The current plaintiff's bouquet features aggressive thorns and flowers that symbolize honesty, while the defendant's suspiciously perfect roses are revealed to be stolen temple offerings when they inexplicably start humming a sacred hymn. As the judge declares victory for the plaintiff, the losing party's flowers dramatically wilt on cue, either divine intervention or some very strategic hot pepper oil applied earlier by the bailiff. As you leave, a vendor hands you a justice blossom guaranteed to reveal lies. You test it by asking if it actually works. It immediately catches fire. Message received: the hangover garden. The restorative grove reeks of regret and overpowering mint, a shaded sanctuary where nobles sprawl across woven mats, groaning as attendants force-feed them anti-nausea blossoms like botanical paramedics. You sidestep a puddle of what might be pulque or possibly someone's dignity as a healer slathers a greenish paste across a warrior's forehead. Cactus flower and shame, she explains cheerfully, though the proportions seem heavily weighted toward the latter. This isn't just gardening, it's damage control for an empire that partied too hard under last night's full moon. The treatments follow strict protocols. First the stomach settlers, marigold tea so bitter it shocks the system into sobriety, then the headache vines, cool tendrils wrapped around throbbing temples, and finally the spiritual recalibration, being buried up to the neck in compost while priests chant about moderation. A particularly miserable nobleman whimpers as attendants dunk him in a lily pond, which seems excessive until you notice he's still wearing his ceremonial headdress from whatever ill-advised bet led to this moment. Historians still argue whether these gardens actually cured hangovers or just made the suffering more picturesque, but watching a group of warriors instantly sober upon spotting the emperor's approaching floral litter, you suspect the latter. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the science. Aztec healers understood synergism centuries before modern medicine. Their signature, 5-flower punch, combined morning glory to constrict blood vessels, good. Chocolate flowers for endorphins, great. A mysterious third ingredient called laughing pollen, concerning. Marigold as a gastric buffer, smart. Pure spite to keep drinking, problematic. Now for the quirky tidbit. The gardens have their own Hall of Shame, where particularly spectacular overindulgers are memorialized in floral arrangements. Today's featured fool is represented by wilting lilies surrounding an empty pulque vase, with an inscription that roughly translates to Lord 8 Rabbit, who mistook the reflecting pool for a toilet and the high priest's wife for a goddess. The current record holder? A merchant who allegedly tried to pay his bar tab with flowers he'd stolen from his own wedding bouquet. The real action happens at the recovery races, where hungover nobles compete to cross the garden while balancing healing blossoms on their heads. The winner gets a cure, the losers get another round of compost burial. You watch as last night's party champion, still wearing one gold sandal, faceplants directly into a patch of alertness herbs that apparently work better when snorted. As attendants peel him off the lawn, a gardener casually replants the crushed specimens while muttering about fertilizer. As you leave, a vendor offers you preventative petals, flowers to eat before drinking that supposedly guarantee no hangover. The small print warns they may also cause prophetic visions and/or temporary ownership of all nearby livestock. You decline, but not before noticing the emperor's personal florist stocking up on enough for a small army. Some mysteries solve themselves, children of the cornflower. The naming ceremony smells like hope and crushed dandelions, a humble hut where a midwife grinds common weeds into paste to anoint a newborn's forehead. You watch as the parents whisper names to each blossom before choosing. Xochitl, for the wild morning glory that strangles cornfields yet feeds bees, or Quitlawak, for the stubborn marsh reed that bends but never breaks. These aren't insults, they're survival poetry, wrapping children in the resilience of plants that flourish where fancy flowers perish. The grandmother chuckles as the baby grabs a fistful of chickweed. See? She's chosen her own spirit plant already. Contrary to noble naming traditions, where kids get bombastic titles like, "He who strikes like orchids in the wind," commoners believe weed names offer protection. Call a child after something unwanted, the logic goes, and misfortune will overlook them like gardeners ignoring a useful herb. Historians still argue whether this reflected genuine folk wisdom or just creative poverty, but watching a mother tuck a sprig of purslane into her son's loincloth, for luck, you're inclined to believe the former. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals deeper meaning: each weed carries secret virtues. The much maligned pigweed, amaranthus, actually provides more protein than maize, while humble plantain leaves make better bandages than the finest linen. The current elder demonstrates by brewing thief's thyme into a tea that supposedly makes children unnoticeable to evil, or at least very sleepy. Better than those fragile noble blooms, she mutters, eyeing a passing aristocrat's wilting gardenia headdress. Now for the quirky tidbit. Children undergo annual, name renewal, ceremonies where they race through fields to find their namesake plant in bloom. You witness little Miss Quibble, Mesquite, triumphantly drag home a thorny branch twice his size while his sister, Caustic, Yellow Dock, sulks because her plant only grows near latrines. Their mother consoles her by pointing out that Doc stops diarrhea, which is more useful than any perfumed lily. The real tearjerker? The foundling garden, where abandoned babies are left nestled in patches of soft chickweed, each swaddled with a single blossom to determine their name. The current caretaker shows you rows of thriving, weed children, now adults, who return every year to tend the plot. One warrior-turned-farmer proudly displays the scar where his stinging nettle namesake was tattooed during manhood rites. Hurts less than my brother's cactus fruit tattoo, he laughs. As you leave, a girl named Malinali, wild grass, braids a crown of clover for her baby brother. It's lopsided and already wilting, but when she whispers, "Grow strong like you, little weed," you realize you've witnessed the most beautiful horticulture lesson of all, the first florist strike. Dawn breaks over eerily silent chinampas, no songs of gardeners, no clatter of digging sticks, just the nervous chatter of confused ducks. You pick your way through abandoned plots where flowers wilt in protest and unfinished seed beds spell out rude words in sprout patterns. The work stoppage began when imperial overseers demanded tribute blossoms from already over-harvested gardens, but the final straw was confiscating the workers' sacred, resting marigolds. Now, the empire's floral economy grinds to a halt as everyone from noble estate gardeners to sewage blossom tenders folds their arms and lets the petals fall where they may. The strike leaders hold court in a repurposed compost shed, their demands scratched onto cactus paper, reasonable work hours, payment in actual food rather than floral exposure, and crucially, the right to pee without accounting for every lost minute. A grizzled grower waves a fistful of desiccated herbs, the remains of last year's motivational bouquet from the emperor that promised eternal floral glory but delivered only blisters and back pain. Historians still argue whether this was genuine labor reform or just really bad timing during peak pollination season, but watching a priest try and fail to arrange his own ceremonial bouquet, result, looks like a jaguar sat on it, you're leaning toward the former. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the stakes. Aztec cities consumed over 20,000 fresh blossoms daily for rituals alone. By day 3 of the strike, temple altars sport suspiciously similar-looking paper flowers, and the emperor's breakfast tortillas arrive unadorned for the first time in living memory. The nobility panic by black market blooms, only to discover too late that the rare orchids are just painted onions. Now for the quirky tidbit. The strikers develop an elaborate communication system using talking vines. They train morning glories to grow in specific patterns across canal bridges, spirals for hold firm, zigzags for new negotiations. When authorities catch on and cut the vines, the gardeners simply switch to pumpkin sprouts that grow faster and form rudimentary words. A particularly cheeky patch near the palace spells out, "Pay US," in near-perfect glyphs before being accidentally trampled by rebellious alpacas. The standoff breaks when the striking florists play their trump card. They'd secretly been hybridizing all the empire's flowers to require their specialized care. Without daily singing, precise lunar phase pruning, and those special compost blends only they knew, the blossoms begin an alarming synchronized wilting. As nobles watch their prized gardens deteriorate in real time, the emperor caves, signing the first-ever gardening contract in cactus ink while pointedly ignoring how the signing bouquet is 80% weeds. As the gardeners return triumphantly to their plots, you spot the real victory, an apprentice sneaking chocolate flowers into the imperial seed vault. The revolution, it seems, will be pollinated, sacrificial arrangements. The temple precinct smells like copper and gardenias, a nauseatingly sweet contrast as priests weave blossoms through the hair of bound captives, their floral adornments growing steadily darker with dripping sacrifice. You try not to flinch as a priestess selects a night-blooming heart flower from her basket, its petals splayed like an anatomical drawing, and presses it to a warrior's chest where it pulses faintly with his heartbeat. This isn't decoration, it's divine botany, where the line between offering and offered blurs in the smoke. The rituals follow precise floral mathematics, 52 blossoms per ceremony, one for each year in the sacred cycle, arranged so their shadows form a perfect quincunx at midday. The current high priest adjusts a captive sunflower garland with the care of a stylist preparing a bride, murmuring how the petals will guide his soul like solar sails. Historians still argue whether these living arrangements ease transitions to the afterlife or just made executions more aesthetically pleasing, but watching a condemned man smile as he's handed a blossom that matches his daughter's birth flower, you suspect the truth is uncomfortably both. Here's the mainstream fact that chills: the flowers aren't just symbolic, they're functional. The famous blood orchids have hollow stems that direct offerings into ceremonial bowls, while speaking marigolds, placed on lips supposedly carry final words to the gods. A priest demonstrates by holding a blossom to a warrior's mouth before his sacrifice. When later burned, the petals crackle in patterns that scribes interpret as, "Tell my mother I ate the honey cakes." Now for the quirky tidbit, the temple maintains a soul garden where each sacrificed warrior's favorite flower is replanted. You walk among blooms allegedly imbued with personalities, a cocky zinnia that outlives 3 generations of gardeners, a shy violet that only opens for one specific priest's songs, and the infamous, drunken peony, that wilts dramatically whenever pulque is nearby. The head gardener whispers that some nobles now request specific flowers for their own eventual sacrifices, the botanical equivalent of picking your funeral playlist. The most disturbing beauty lies in the breathing bouquets, arrangements where flowers are woven into a living person's skin via shallow thorn pricks so the blossoms feed on blood and breath. A young acolyte proudly displays his offering arm, threaded with jasmine that pulses unervingly with his pulse. They'll last 3 days after plucking, he boasts, then pales when an older priest adds, or until the gods get hungry. As you leave, the sunset stains the temple's flower-strewn steps the color of old wounds. A single discarded blossom, a forget-me-not dahlia, trembles in the wind as if whispering names. You step carefully around it, though no one would begrudge you the small mercy of crushing it underfoot. The talking cactus cult. The desert shrine vibrates with off-key chanting as barefoot devotees dance around a towering saguaro cactus, its arms outstretched like a grumpy teacher tired of nonsense. You duck as a zealot swings a sacred rattle, made from dried peyote buttons, his pupils dilated enough to see into next week. Behold the thorn prophet, he shrieks, pointing to a particularly crooked cactus that, if you squint and maybe ingest some questionable tea, vaguely resembles a grumbling old man. This isn't botany, it's the most chaotic revival meeting in Mesoamerica, where the faithful believe cacti whisper divine truths, when they're not busy being moody houseplants. The high priest, self-appointed after a vision involving a misidentified Joshua tree, demonstrates the sacred ritual, watering the cactus at midnight with tequila-fermented spit while reciting grocery lists as prayers. The prophet prefers complaints about back pain, he confides, scratching down the cactus's latest revelation, which looks suspiciously like a shopping reminder for tortillas and laxatives. Historians still argue whether this cult was spiritual innovation or just collective heatstroke, but watching an acolyte earnestly lick a cactus spine for wisdom, then spend the next hour picking fuzz from his tongue, you're leaning toward the latter. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the appeal. In Aztec symbology, cacti represented endurance and protection. The cult just took it further by arguing that spiky plants were the Earth's nervous system, with each spine a divine antenna. The current listening ceremony involves pressing one's ear to a barrel cactus while drinking enough hallucinogenic tea to make a jaguar question its life choices. One woman weeps as she translates the cactus's message. It says, "My ex-husband will step on a thorn." A big one. Now for the quirky tidbit. The sect's holy texts are actually just cactus needles pressed into bark paper to form braille-like messages. You watch the scribe painstakingly assemble today's revelation. Stop watering me so much, you maniacs. When asked how this differs from regular cactus behavior, the high priest sniffs that context makes it sacred. He then trips over the silent monk, a particularly grumpy specimen that allegedly hasn't spoken in 20 years but still gets offerings of fermented fruit, just in case. The real spectacle is the annual Cactus Communion, where devotees eat carefully measured peyote slices to sync their vibrations with the plants. This year's ceremony devolves into chaos when someone misreads the dosage and half the congregation becomes convinced they're photosynthetic. You watch as a warrior hugs a prickly pear for 3 straight hours, whispering, "I feel us photosynthesizing together, brother," while his wife rolls her eyes and goes home. As you leave, a young convert presses a blessed spine into your hand. For protection, he murmurs. You wait until he's out of sight to toss it, directly into a cactus's shadow, just to be safe, monarch butterfly male. The way station hums with wings, thousands of monarchs clustering on nectar-filled message boards, their orange and black patterns forming living hieroglyphs as they feed. You watch as a scribe carefully ties a tiny bark paper scroll to a butterfly's leg using spun orchid fibers, whispering the recipient's name to the flower it chooses first. The blooms remember, He insists when the insect immediately heads for a marigold tagged for a general's wife 80 miles north. This isn't just pretty symbolism, it's the empire's most efficient communication system, where every garden doubles as a post office and bad news arrives on iridescent wings. The rules are precise: pink flowers for love letters, red for military alerts, and under no circumstances use the night-blooming cereus unless you want your message read aloud to the entire temple. Their nectar makes butterflies tipsy and gossipy. A fleet handler shows you the priority messaging blooms, specially bred to produce euphoria-inducing nectar that makes monarchs fly 30% faster. Historians still argue whether the system was reliable or just bureaucratically beautiful, but watching a butterfly detour to slap its wings across a cheating merchant's face before delivering his wife's "thinking of you" scroll, you suspect the former. Here's the mainstream fact that grounded this system in reality: monarchs follow the same migratory routes annually, with waystation gardens planted precisely along their path. The current map keeper points out a bloom-marked route stretching from Tenochtitlan to the northern deserts, a floral highway maintained by generations of gardeners who've never seen a butterfly ignore a rest stop marigold. They're more punctual than imperial runners, he boasts, then winces as a late-season straggler drunkenly collides with a message board. Now for the quirky tidbit: the dead letter office is a sacred copal tree where expired messages bloom into new flowers. You watch a priestess scrape resin from bark paper fragments embedded in the trunk, revealing ghostly impressions of centuries-old grocery lists and bad poetry. One particularly legible scrap reads, "Dear brother, if this reaches you, I've likely been sacrificed. Please water my dahlias." The attached dahlia petal remains suspiciously fresh. The real drama unfolds during the annual migration betting, where nobles wager on which butterfly will reach its destination first. This year's favorite, a particularly robust female tagged with a merchant's bribe for a tax official, gets sabotaged when a rival glues tiny feather weights to her legs. The ensuing scandal leads to the empire's first, and only, butterfly courtroom, where the accused is sentenced to wear weighted sandals until he apologizes to every garden along the route. As you leave, a message butterfly lands on your shoulder, its tiny scroll blank. The scribe smiles. That one's for souls needing to send letters the gods haven't written yet. You don't have the heart to tell him it's probably just lost, the flower clock. The observatory garden ticks, not with gears, but with petals unfurling in staggered precision as moonlight stripes the carefully arranged plots. You stand very still as a timekeeper priest adjusts a night-blooming jasmine's position, his ear pressed to its stem like a watchmaker listening for a skipped beat. "There," he murmurs as the blossom yawns open on cue, its perfume releasing alongside three others in perfect sequence. This isn't just botany, it's a living chronometer where constellations move according to floral rather than stellar time. The system runs on solar flowers that track daylight hours and morning blooms that mark the moon's passage. The current head timekeeper, his robe embroidered with zodiacal blossoms, demonstrates by holding a sunflower at arm's length. When its shadow touches the obsidian marker at his feet, it's officially midday. Or would be, if the flower hadn't gotten overwatered and drooped 15 minutes early. Historians still argue whether these floral clocks were scientific instruments or just really elaborate gardening journals, but watching a priest predict an eclipse based solely on how violently the eclipse lilies were vibrating, you're inclined to believe both. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the genius: Aztecs noticed certain flowers open/close within 5 minutes of the same time daily, unaffected by weather. The clock garden arranges these humanely bred blooms in concentric circles, each ring tracking different time increments. You walk the circles like stepping through hours: morning glories for dawn, passion flowers for midday, and those creepy moon gulper blossoms that scream, yes, actually scream, when it's midnight. The current record holder for accuracy? A humble marshweed that somehow always opens at the winter solstice's exact second, possibly because it's actually 3 beetles in a leaf costume. This remains unverified. Now for the quirky tidbit: the empire had flower-based alarm systems. Priests trained trumpet vines to uncoil at specific times, whipping against copper plates to create a buzzing wake-up call. You witness a trainee oversleep and get bombarded by ripe seed pods launched from disciplinary sunflowers. More effective than roosters, less pleasant than sunrise. The real magic happens during the Great Sink, when all temple gardens simultaneously release pollen at the spring equinox. Timekeepers spend weeks prepping blossoms like orchestra musicians tuning instruments, arguing over whether the full moon makes flowers run fast or just more dramatic. This year's event goes awry when someone's experimental chili blossom hybrid triggers a sneezing fit that throws off the count. The resulting leap moment gets incorporated into the calendar as the hour of itchy noses. As you leave, an apprentice gifts you a personal sundial, a potted daisy that supposedly tracks mealtimes. By sunset, it's wilted in protest. You make a mental note to ask the strike leaders from Section 24 for gardening tips, avocado blossom economics. The exchange floor smells like green gold and desperation. Merchant princes elbow each other to sniff baskets of tiny avocado flowers, their nasal assessments determining fortunes. You watch as a trader licks a blossom, strictly forbidden, but everyone does it, before offering 3 jade necklaces for a single basket. His rival counters with a live turkey, which seems excessive until you learn this particular cultivar's pollen can triple an orchard's yield. This isn't agriculture, it's Wall Street with more petals and louder screaming. The frenzy stems from avocado flowers' bizarre biology. Each bloom opens twice, first as female, then as male, with only a 4-hour window for perfect pollination. The current market king, recognizable by his pollen-dusted eyelashes and permanent squint from staring at tiny pistils, demonstrates the grading system. Prime blossoms get dusted with quetzal feather brushes into pearl-lined boxes, while market grade gets tossed into baskets that servants haul off to hopeful orchards. Historians still argue whether this market reflected real agricultural value or just collective mania, but watching a merchant sell his daughter's dowry bracelet for a basket of guaranteed blooms that turn out to be painted corn husks, you're guessing both. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the madness. Avocado flowers are notoriously shy pollinators, with less than 1 in 5,000 setting fruit naturally. The prized Flicolula strain could boost that to 1 in 100, making growers willing to pay, well, whatever that guy just offered his firstborn son for 6 blossoms. The auctioneer, hoarse from shouting pollen counts all morning, shows you the wall of shame, frames holding failed counterfeit blooms, including the infamous bee-glued scandal of 1502 that collapsed 3 family fortunes. Now for the quirky tidbit. The market has its own flower whisperers who claim to predict pollination success by listening to buds with hollow bones. One such expert presses a deer femur to a blossom, nods sagely, and declares it will fruit on a Tuesday. His accuracy rate? Better than the gods, he sniffs, though you notice his assistant discreetly cross-pollinating everything behind his back just in case. The real action happens at the after-hours pit, where growers trade pollen like narcotics, measuring doses on feather scales and cutting deals in code. A particularly shady transaction involves moon dust, pollen collected during eclipses, that supposedly makes avocados grow heart-shaped. The buyer doesn't care that it's just regular pollen mixed with ground-up fireflies. He's selling the story, not the fruit. As you leave, a bankrupt merchant offers you a surefire blossom guaranteed to grow an avocado tree overnight. It's clearly just a stick with petals glued on, but his desperation smells genuine. You pay in cacao beans, not for the fraud, but for the lesson in how hope can pollinate even the rockiest soil, the dying art. The preservation vault smells like a library crossed with a morgue, herbal embalming fluids and the faint sweetness of centuries-old petals lingering in cedar cabinets. You watch as the last living flower mummy specialist, her fingers stained permanently blue from some arcane chemical, carefully injects a rose's stem with a syringe of liquefied moonlight, or possibly just distilled lake water, and lies. This isn't taxidermy, it's necromantic botany, where blossoms are tricked into believing they've never been plucked. The techniques read like witch recipes: bathe orchids in liquid amber during a new moon, press lilies between sheets of hummingbird skin parchment, suspend marigolds in beehive fumes for exactly 13 days. The current practitioner, her face obscured by a veil of woven spider silk to prevent breath contamination, demonstrates by dunking a sunflower into what she claims is the tears of a goddess, but smells suspiciously like fermented agave. Historians still argue whether these preserved flowers actually lasted centuries or if the Aztecs just kept replacing them and hoping nobody noticed, but examining a supposedly 200-year-old jasmine that still releases scent when stroked, you're inclined to believe the former. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the stakes: properly preserved flowers held legal weight equal to written contracts. The vault's prize specimen is a cactus bloom used to seal a land treaty in 1432, its notarized pollen still technically binding. A scribe lets you peer through an emerald magnifier at the signature, fossilized V legs arranged in a warlord's name. Still enforceable, he whispers, then quickly locks it away before you ask about statute of limitations. Now for the quirky tidbit: the best preservers were blindfolded during critical steps to prevent soul contamination from their vision. You witness an apprentice working entirely by touch, her hands moving like a pianist's as she stitches a crumbling peony back together with threads of morning dew. When she accidentally pricks her finger, she hisses not from pain but because, now it'll only last 90 years instead of 100. The real tragedy unfolds in the failure wing, where desiccated experiments float in shame-filled jars. A particularly sad case labeled Emperor's Anniversary Bouquet, 1499, looks like charcoal briquettes with delusions of grandeur. The current mistress of preservation taps the glass mournfully. We told him roses were vain. He insisted. Now history remembers his gift as this. As you leave, she presses a single everbloom into your palm, a common daisy preserved by lost methods, still soft after decades. Don't ask how, she sighs. Just know it'll outlive you, your children, and probably this empire. You tuck it away carefully, though you're not sure whether it's a gift or a burden. Floral face filters. The imperial vanity chamber reeks of crushed rose hips and aristocratic desperation. Noblewomen sit motionless as servants press damp flower petals to their faces like living makeup, each blossom selected to enhance or conceal. You watch a duchess endure 30 minutes of moonbeam marigold applications to fade a particularly unfortunate sunspot, only to emerge looking less youthful glow, and more recently exhumed. This isn't skincare, it's photosynthesis cosplay, where nobility tries to photosynthesize their way to beauty through sheer floral stubbornness. The treatments follow sacred beauty calendars: jasmine for Mondays, to soften, hibiscus for Wednesdays, to intimidate rivals, and the dreaded truth time Fridays where spouses must endure unflattering herbal masks that allegedly reveal infidelity through rash patterns. The current esthetician, her own face a disturbing shade of orchid purple, pauses mid-application to scold a young noble for fidgeting. You want your pores to look like you farm maize? Hold still. Historians still argue whether these regimens actually worked or just kept nobles too flower-plastered to cause trouble, but watching a countess's age spots vanish under strategically placed lily petals, until she sneezes, you suspect the latter. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the science: certain flowers do have legitimate skincare properties. The Red Queen's Mask, made from crushed dahlias and ant blood, really does reduce inflammation, while Virgin's Veil, Morning Glory Sap, provides primitive SPF protection. The head beautician demonstrates by slathering your forearm in Warrior's Balm, a waxy blend of sunflower oil and bee venom that makes your skin feel both invincible and mildly electrocuted. Now for the quirky tidbit: the most coveted treatment isn't for faces, but for voices. Nobles inhale steamed song blossoms that coat their vocal cords in floral resins, making them sound like whispering through a spring meadow. You witness a merchant prince test his newly melodious voice by singing a ballad to his accountant, who promptly knocks over an abacus to make him stop. The real madness unfolds in the imperial filter garden, where nobles pose among blooms genetically bullied, through selective breeding and threats, to complement their features. A vain warlord spends hours finding the exact shade of carnation that makes his battle scars look mysterious rather than clumsy, while his wife cultivates a personal rose variant that blooms in a perfect heart shape whenever she walks by. It's not vanity, she sniffs, adjusting a petal behind her ear. It's civic duty, the people need beauty to aspire to. The rose, sensing her tone, spitefully drops 3 petals down her back. As you leave, an apprentice offers you a quick glow treatment involving pressed violets and shame. You decline, though not before noticing the emperor's portrait, his famous, ageless, complexion achieved through layers of petal paste so thick he probably had to turn sideways to exit rooms, the drunken gardener. The brewmaster's hut smells like a bouquet's hangover, overripe petals fermenting in clay vats burp floral-scented gases at irregular intervals. You sidestep a puddle of something that might be hibiscus wine or possibly a failed experiment as the master brewer, his apron stained every color of the rainbow, stirs a vat with what looks suspiciously like a retired war club. This batch listens to poetry, he slurs, offering you a cup of liquid that changes flavor depending on whether you hold it in your left or right hand. This isn't just drinking, it's botanical roulette, where every sip could be a love potion or a laxative. The sacred recipes sound like children's dares: soak gardenias in honey for 13 moons, add just enough chili powder to make the gods sneeze, then bury the jar under a pregnant alpaca for good luck. The current star beverage, Quetzal's Kiss, involves fermenting orchids with frog saliva and moonlight. You watch a visiting noble take 1 sip, declare he can see through time, then spend 20 minutes apologizing to a potted fern for past leafy injustices. Historians still argue whether these drinks had actual psychotropic properties or Aztecs just really committed to the placebo effect, but watching a priestess correctly predict rain after drinking truth-teller tulip wine, you're inclined to believe both. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the obsession: flower wines were the original energy drinks. Warriors chugged Eagle Blossom ale before battles for stamina, while midwives sipped Gentle Dawn infusions during long deliveries. The brewmaster shows you the emergency ration wall, tiny vials labeled things like "for when the emperor asks about taxes again" and "in-laws visiting, double strength." Now for the quirky tidbit: the fermentation temple has its own hangover garden, where overindulgers recover among specially bred anti-nausea blossoms. You witness a merchant prince being rolled through the pity vines like a human compost pile while attendants force-feed him morning after marigolds. Their effectiveness is questionable, given he still moans about the hummingbirds laughing at him. The real spectacle is the annual Flower Cup, where brewers compete to make the most potent, or most hallucinogenic, concoction. This year's winner is a deceptively mild-looking lavender wine that causes temporary synesthesia. You watch as judges start tasting colors and describing sounds as spicy. The disqualified entry? A carnation ale that didn't intoxicate drinkers but made all their jewelry tarnish instantly, which feels more like witchcraft than mixology. As you leave, walking suspiciously straight compared to everyone else, an apprentice slips you a tiny, travel flask of something labeled for emergency celebrations. You wait until safely outside to try it. The first sip tastes like regret and rose hips. The second tastes like someone explaining the meaning of life very slowly using only fruit metaphors. You decide to keep the rest for, well, emergencies, seed vault security. The entrance to the Imperial Seed Bank smells like paranoia and cedar oil. Guards with orchid-patterned tattoos frisk you for contraband pollen before allowing passage through 3 separate doors made from wood that screams if tampered with. Inside, the head archivist, his breath held in permanent suspension from years of not disturbing the air, moves like a ghost between shelves of seeds sealed in jade tubes, each labeled with warnings more dire than the last. This one, he whispers, pointing to a humble-looking maize kernel, gets watered with the tears of failed thieves. The vault isn't just storage, it's a living library where each seed variety has its own memory keeper, a priest trained to recite its entire lineage back to mythical first harvests. The current keeper demonstrates by singing a 3-hour ballad about a single squash seed's journey from some god's sandal to this very jar. Historians still argue whether this oral tradition preserved actual agricultural knowledge or just really boring campfire stories, but watching a gardener successfully revive a 200-year-old flower from a seed paired with its memory song, you suspect both. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the stakes: losing a seed variety meant losing its associated gods. The infamous Great Amaranth Fiasco of 1489 nearly collapsed rain rituals until a single surviving seed was found wedged in a priest's sandal. Now, that miracle seeds, descendants grow in a gold-plated pot guarded by warriors with instructions to kill first, ask about watering schedules never. Now for the quirky tidbit: the vault has its own seed hospital, where failing varieties are nursed back to health. You watch archivists administer tiny doses of fermented fish guts to anemic tomato seeds while whispering encouragement. The current patient is a legendary jumping bean that supposedly sprouts faster if insulted daily. Ugly little dirt pebble coos its caretaker, and sure enough, a tiny green tendril unfurls in response. The real security lies in the vault's living locks, flowers bred to react violently to unauthorized touch. One shelf is protected by vines that whip intruders' wrists. Another has blossoms that scream in high-pitched tones only dogs and nervous nobles can hear. The most precious seeds rest behind truth lilies that spray thieves with permanent dye. A faded purple stain on the ceiling suggests someone once tried entering through the roof. They presumably regret it. As you leave, after proving you're not smuggling anything by eating a handful of random seeds in front of witnesses, the archivist gifts you a single memory bean, a common variety, but with its lineage song included on a miniature scroll. Plant it with the ballad, he instructs. Unless you want ungrateful, tone-deaf vegetables. You pocket it carefully, already dreading the 45-verse chorus about soil acidity, the flower that never was. The map room smells like obsession and mildew, explorers' charts pinned to every surface, each marked with frantic circles around regions labeled here, or maybe here, or one particularly desperate, why not here? You run your finger along a mural depicting the legendary Zacatonal, a flower supposedly glowing with internal light that guides souls to paradise. Its petals shimmer enticingly in the artwork, which makes it all the more jarring when the head cartographer sweeps in and angrily paints over it with a muttered, "Not real." Again. This collective delusion started with a single mention in a 200-year-old poem about blooms brighter than stars plucked from the sky's garden. Over generations, it solidified into an accepted truth, sending expeditions scrambling into jungles and over mountains. The current search party leader, his eyes twitching from sleep deprivation, demonstrates his proof, a pressed flower that's clearly just a moth wing glued to a weed, but don't tell him that. Historians still argue whether this was mass hallucination or an elaborate prank by rival city-states, but watching a botanist sacrifice his marriage to hunt for the Zacatonal in active volcano craters, you're leaning toward the former. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the danger: the myth became so entrenched that questioning it was heresy. The Imperial Garden maintains an empty plot labeled Zacatonal, currently traveling, where priests leave offerings, just in case. The head gardener shows you the disappointment ledger, records of 743 failed expeditions, each ending with some variation of maybe next rainy season. Now for the quirky tidbit: the searches spawned an entire industry of fake Zacatonal peddlers. You witness a trial where a merchant is accused of selling authentic guiding flowers that turned out to be fireflies tied to dandelions. His defense? They did glow. The judge sentences him to tend the empty Zacatonal plot until either it blooms or you admit defeat, which amounts to life imprisonment. The real tragedy unfolds in the Seeker's Tavern, where failed explorers drink away their regrets in Zacatonal-themed cocktails, blue honey mead with a deceptive glow. One veteran shows you his evidence satchel, 17 years' worth of incorrect flowers, each lovingly preserved. This one smelled like hope for 3 whole days, he whispers, stroking a crumbled weed. His latest map has one remaining unchecked location, his own backyard, because sometimes the treasure was home all along, or possibly because he's broke. As you leave, an apprentice slips you a seed wrapped in bark paper. From the real Zacatonal, he swears. It's obviously a pebble, but you pocket it anyway, not because you believe, but because you understand that some journeys matter more than their destinations. Gardener Guild Secrets. The initiation chamber smells like terror and overripe melons. Neophytes kneel blindfolded in a circle, each clutching a truth cactus that'll supposedly prick them if they lie during the oath. You press against a wall carved with floral motifs that suspiciously resemble screaming faces as the grand grower, his cloak woven from what looks like human hair and vines, intones the first question: do you swear to prioritize photosynthesis over family? A nervous gulp comes from candidate number 3, whose cactus immediately draws blood. The guild doesn't expel him, they just assign him extra weeding duty for eternity. This isn't just a trade union, it's a botanical Illuminati where members communicate through coded flower arrangements and can kill with a well-placed thorn. The current test involves identifying 6 nearly identical medicinal herbs by taste alone. You watch a hopeful spit out what he claims is false chamomile, only to learn it's actually his guild sponsor's prized wig. Historians still argue whether these rituals preserved ancient knowledge or just provided entertainment for sadistic horticulturists, but watching a candidate successfully graft an apple to a watermelon while reciting poetry backward, you suspect both. Here's the mainstream fact that explains the paranoia: guild members knew which flowers could heal or kill in identical-looking doses. The infamous laughing death incident saw an entire banquet hall collapse in giggles, then death, because someone confused bliss blossoms with their toxic doppelgangers. The current safety demonstration involves 2 nearly identical violets. One grants prophetic dreams, the other makes you allergic to sunlight. The difference? The instructor smiles. About 6 funeral processions. Now for the quirky tidbit: the guild's final exam is part horticulture, part psychological warfare. Candidates must spend a night in the chatting greenhouse, where the plants allegedly gossip about their flaws. You peer through the glass as one initiate turns pale while a Venus flytrap snaps in what looks suspiciously like Morse code for bad at composting. Another flees screaming when a truth orchid blooms to reveal petals patterned like his cheating wife's face. The real power lies in the guild's living contracts, vines that grow around members' wrists, tightening if they break oaths. You watch as a disgraced grower's bracelet vine withers to dust when he admits to watering the emperor's orchids with tap water instead of sacred spring runoff. His punishment? Demotion to public toilet flower tender, the guild's version of hell. As you leave, after politely declining membership 6 times, an apprentice slips you a beginner's bouquet, harmless-looking blooms that arrange themselves into profane shapes when placed in moonlight. For your enemy's gardens, he whispers. You make a mental note to never, ever anger anyone with dirt under their nails, the floating library. The archive hut sways gently on its lake platform, its walls breathing like a living thing as humidity tightens and loosens the flower paper pages within. You watch a scribe carefully unroll a codex made from pressed lily pads, its surface pulsing faintly as if the inked glyphs still draw sustenance from the air. This one gets cranky if read after sunset, he whispers, stroking a page that shimmers with bioluminescent pollen. These aren't just books, they're botanical hard drives where information is stored in chlorophyll and capillary action. The classification system defies logic. Medicinal herbs are shelved by the moon phase they're harvested under, historical records organized by the scent of the flowers they're pressed with. The head archivist, her fingers permanently stained blue from talking ink, a mix of squid ink and orchid nectar, demonstrates how to wake a dormant codex by misting it with water infused with the same flower species used in its pages. The glyphs darken eagerly, though one particularly old tome just seems to sulk until offered a drop of honey. Historians still argue whether these living texts were superior to parchment or just really high maintenance, but watching a battle strategy scroll rearrange its own tactical diagrams when enemy scouts are spotted nearby, you're inclined to believe the former. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the genius: each codex could self-repair minor damage by growing new fibers along tier lines. The current restoration project involves a marriage contract that's been healing itself for 30 years, slowly obscuring the original terms under layers of new growth that suspiciously favor the wife's family. We call it passive-aggressive botany, the archivist sighs. Now for the quirky tidbit: the most dangerous texts are kept in quarantine blooms, flowers genetically manipulated to serve as living censorship. You witness one such blossom unfold to reveal a heretical poem, then promptly eat it. The librarian nods approvingly. Some knowledge pollutes like bad pollen. The real magic happens in the whispering gallery, where historical accounts play back recordings when stroked. A warrior's memoir emits the actual battle cries of long-dead soldiers, while a gardener's journal perfumes the air with flowers extinct for centuries. The piece de resistance? A cookbook that makes your tongue taste ingredients as you read, though the chocolate chapter has been licked suspiciously thin. As you leave, the archivist gifts you a single, memory petal, a flower pressed with instructions for basic maize cultivation that supposedly sprouts when planted with the knowledge. You tuck it away carefully, though you're not sure whether it's a gift or a subtle reminder that your own gardening skills could use divine intervention. Meteorological petals. The weather shrine hums with anticipation as priests crouch over storm lilies, their petals quivering like compass needles before an invisible gale. You watch as the head forecaster, his cloak embroidered with historical hurricanes, presses a seashell to a sunflower's stem, listening intently. The roots say rain in 3 days, he declares, but the buds think it'll hold off. This isn't just observation, it's a floral debate club where correct predictions earn promotions and wrong ones mean composting duty for a lunar cycle. The system relies on indicator species with uncanny environmental sensitivity. The famous earthquake vines coil tightly around their trellises hours before tremors, while drought daisies play dead at the first sign of arid weather, fooling no one. A junior priest demonstrates by blowing gently on a wind rose, its petals unfold in precise increments corresponding to breeze strength. Historians still argue whether this was legitimate science or just confirmation bias, but watching a field of marigolds suddenly all face east moments before a weather shift, you're inclined to believe the former. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the method. Aztecs tracked microseasons through sequential bloom patterns. The current almanac shows illustrations of flowers arranged like a calendar, each petal's unfurling marking transitions between frog rains and jaguar winds. The head priest proudly displays this year's accuracy rate, 87%. Though you notice the failed predictions are attributed to uncooperative flora rather than faulty methodology. Now for the quirky tidbit, the most accurate predictor is also the most embarrassing. A humbleweed called shame blossom droops dramatically when humidity rises, which locals interpret as the plant giving up on good weather. Priests hate relying on it because it makes their forecasts sound whiny. The shame blossoms have surrendered to incoming precipitation, but its accuracy is undeniable. You witness a particularly proud forecaster grit his teeth as he announces, "The cowardly little weeds were right again." The real spectacle is the annual flower forecast tournament, where master gardeners compete to breed the most sensitive meteorological plants. This year's favorite is a hybrid orchid that changes color based on barometric pressure, though it keeps getting distracted by bees and forgetting to predict. The winning entry? A common dandelion that accurately votes on tomorrow's weather by how many seeds it retains overnight. The loser, an elaborate engineered lily that required constant compliments, is ceremonially relocated to the palace gardens where it can be as dramatic as it wants. As you leave, an apprentice hands you a travel forecaster, a potted violet that supposedly curls its leaves before storms. You're skeptical until it suddenly clenches tight just as a raindrop hits your nose. Maybe the plants have been right all along. The rebel rose. The resistance garden hides in plain sight, a tangle of vibrant blooms spilling defiantly over a noble's wall, their thorns snipped into tiny blade shapes. You watch as a street vendor accidentally knocks over a basket of these crimson roses, scattering them across the plaza where quick hands snatch them up to tuck into headbands and cloak hems. This isn't just horticulture, it's sedition with a floral motif, where every petal carries coded meaning and gardeners become generals in a war fought with pruning shears. The rebellion's icon is Quitlawac's thorn, a rose variety bred to flourish where it's unwanted, its roots breaking through stone walls and its perfume lingering for days on clothes. The head gardener, a woman missing 2 fingers from pruning accidents, demonstrates how the blooms are trained to spell glyphs as they grow. This week's message arches over a doorway in thorny script reading, "Still here." Historians still argue whether these floral protests actually threatened the empire or just gave nobles really beautiful headaches, but watching a tax collector sneeze dislodge a hidden rose petal that triggers a neighborhood's worth of mockingbird calls, you suspect both. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the danger: banned flowers became contraband more valuable than weapons. The current black market price for a single Quitlawack cutting is 3 months' wages, though most patriots prefer to liberate them from palace gardens. A street artist shows you his propaganda petals, roses pressed with subversive poems that bloom into readable text when soaked in urine, an ink that nobles would never touch. The empire burns our books, he shrugs, so we write in things that grow back. Now for the quirky tidbit: the resistance's greatest weapon is horticultural humor. You witness gardeners breed roses that drop their petals whenever nobles walk by, dubbed the bowing flowers, train vines to trip specific officials, and plant laughing gardens where blossoms arrange themselves into rude shapes when viewed from palace windows. The current masterpiece? A topiary that looks like the emperor from the front but suspiciously like a duck from the west. The real genius lies in the song soil, special compost that makes flowers hum revolutionary tunes when wind passes through their petals. A street musician demonstrates by strumming a lute near a trained rosebush. It echoes back the melody of a band folk song. As guards approach, the plants instantly switch to a sanctioned hymn, leaving the soldiers scratching their helmets. As you leave, a child slips you a single thorn wrapped in cloth. "For your garden," she whispers. You don't have the heart to tell her you lack both a garden and a revolution to tend. Still, you tuck it away. Not every seed needs fertile ground to matter, just the right moment to sprout. Floral espionage. The flower shop smells like intrigue and overpriced roses, a front for the empire's most delicate intelligence operations. You watch as a noblewoman selects a seemingly innocent bouquet while the florist, whose hands move a bit too precisely for someone who just arranges posies, adjusts a lily's angle to encode today's troop movements. This isn't gift-giving, it's geopolitical warfare where a misplaced carnation could accidentally declare war. The cipher system is diabolically simple: flower species correspond to cities, petal counts indicate numbers, and fragrance intensity conveys urgency. A vase of casual wildflowers on the counter demonstrates harmless messages: your wife prefers peonies, while the back room holds arrangements that could topple dynasties. The emperor's nephew plots rebellion. Send more chocolate. Historians still argue whether this network was foolproof or just really lucky, but watching a spy panic when his all-clear bouquet gets mistaken for a romantic gesture and delivered to the wrong person, you suspect the latter. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the stakes: during wartime, florists underwent military training. The current bloom strategist, a grandmotherly type who could kill you with a well-thrown gladiolus, demonstrates how to conceal poison in hollow stems and roll maps into pollen tubes. Her masterpiece? A funeral wreath that blooms into a battlefield map when watered with wine. Grief makes people careless with liquids, she notes sweetly. Now for the quirky tidbit: the system's weakest link was courtship. You witness a young spy's cover nearly blown when his enemy approaching bouquet gets interpreted as a marriage proposal by his target's love-struck daughter. The resulting confusion leads to history's most awkward invasion delay while everyone sorts out the romantic versus military implications of those peonies. The real genius lies in the garden drop points, public flower beds where agents could accidentally brush against specific blooms to receive coated pollen dust on their clothes. A veteran spy shows you how to collect messages by swiping a sleeve across morning dew-laden petals, then reading the resulting pattern under sunlight. Just don't sneeze, he warns. That's how we lost Agent Marigold. As you leave, the florist gifts you a harmless-looking daisy with a wink. Its petals form perfect circles, the spy network symbol for, you've said too much already. You make a mental note to check your shoes for tracking pollen, the great wilt. The imperial gardens smell like funeral incense, row upon row of blossoms drooping in unison, their stems blackening as if dipped in invisible ink. You watch the head gardener, his once proud floral tattoos now sagging like the plants they honor, snap a seemingly healthy rose stem, revealing a hollow core crawling with tiny beetles no one's ever seen before. This isn't just bad luck, it's ecological vengeance, as flowers across the empire stage a synchronized die-off that makes the nobility realize, perhaps too late, that their power was always rooted in borrowed beauty. The blight moves with malicious creativity, first the ceremonial blooms in temples, then the medicinal herbs, finally the staple crops. Priests scramble to interpret omens while practical gardeners quietly pack their tools. "The earth is divorcing us," mutters a farmer, watching his ancestral corn wither mid-prayer. Historians still argue whether this was natural pathogen or divine punishment. For that time the emperor tried grafting cacti to mangoes, for fun, but watching a team of botanists sacrifice a goat to a compost pile in desperation, you suspect nature finally had enough. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the panic: the blight respected no boundaries. The famed floating gardens, once immune to land-based pests, succumb when mysterious waterborne spores turn their roots to mush. The emperor's private greenhouse, where exotic blooms were pampered with moonlight baths and hummingbird serenades, falls last, its collapse marked by the symbolic death of a 200-year-old ceremonial orchid that had survived 7 previous dynasties. Its final petal lands face down, the worst possible omen. Now for the quirky tidbit: the only flowers thriving are the ones everyone hated. That invasive devil's eyelash vine the nobility spent centuries eradicating? Suddenly it's everywhere, cheerfully strangling dying prize roses. The stinking corpse flower that was banned from cities? Booming like it's auditioning for a botanical revolution. Underground, radical gardeners begin cultivating these trash blooms in secret, realizing too late that survival might mean embracing what they once scorned. The real tragedy unfolds in the marketplace, where florists who once commanded jade prices now hawk memory bouquets, dead flowers dipped in wax to preserve their ghostly beauty. A child asks why the petals crumble at a touch. "Because everything does, eventually," her mother replies, pocketing the coins from their last sale. Nearby, a priest auctions off blessed seeds that are just painted pebbles, because hope is the final crop to wither. As you leave, you spot a single intact blossom, a humble weed pushing through temple steps. No one bothers to uproot it. There's a new respect now for things that thrive without permission: bathhouse blossoms. The steam room smells like 1,000 crushed dreams and one overly ambitious jasmine bush, humid air thick with the scent of flowers being boiled alive for your relaxation. You sink into a petal-strewn pool as an attendant dumps a basket of muscle-melting magnolias into the water, their waxy leaves sticking to your skin like nature's band-aids. This isn't just bathing, it's aggressive horticultural therapy where flowers don't just scent your soak but actively medicate it, whether you want them to or not. The baths follow strict floral protocols: lotus for grief, it makes you cry prettier tears; hibiscus for bad decisions, it turns your skin pink so at least you look healthy while regretting everything; and the infamous truth time that gets added to politicians' baths before important negotiations. A healer demonstrates by dunking a complaining merchant into clarity broth, a suspiciously green liquid that either cures back pain or makes you forget you had it. Historians still argue whether these treatments had real medicinal value or just provided plausible deniability for hangovers, but watching a warrior emerge from a rosehip bath with visible scars faded, you suspect both. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the science: Aztecs understood transdermal medicine. The current master healer shows you how pain petals, white flowers that secrete numbing sap, are woven into floating mats for arthritis sufferers. "We used to just tell people to stop being old," she admits, "but this sells better." Nearby, a gout sufferer willingly sits in a poultice of crushed stinging nettles because the alternative is listening to my wife's cousin's poetry. Now for the quirky tidbit: the most coveted treatment isn't for people at all. The warrior steam room is actually for weapons. Blades and shields get nestled in herb beds so they absorb courage. You watch a young soldier carefully position his obsidian dagger between some valor vines, then look devastated when an attendant mistakes it for a backscratcher. The real spectacle is the weekly flower beating, where bathers are gently pummeled with herb-filled cloth bundles. Today's volunteer, a merchant who ate an entire wheel of stolen cheese, groans as attendants whack him with digestion packs of mint and chili flowers. It's working, he lies through gritted teeth, while his stomach makes sounds like a jaguar in a washing machine. As you leave, pruner than a raisin and smelling like a perfumer's accident, an apprentice hands you a hangover seed, a tiny pod guaranteed to grow whatever flower your body needs most. You plant it that night. It grows a single sad-looking bloom that vaguely resembles a cocktail glass. Message received: the sunflower conspiracy. The palace garden's forbidden corner smells like rebellion and upturned soil, a suspiciously sunny patch where all plants grow lopsided, straining toward some invisible light source. You watch as the head gardener digs up yet another rogue sunflower seedling, its leaves already forming the distinctive spiral pattern that got its species banished decades ago. "They're still trying," he mutters, wiping sweat from his brow. This isn't just weeding, it's ideological warfare against a flower that refused to know its place. The trouble started when astronomers noticed palace sunflowers didn't track the sun, they pointed constantly toward the emperor's throne instead. Flattering at first, until a junior priest did the math and realized the flowers were actually indicating the exact spot where a previous ruler had been assassinated. "Coincidence," declared the court, while quietly removing every sunflower from the premises. Historians still argue whether the plants were genuinely sensitive to energy fields or just really bad at photosynthesis, but watching a smuggled-in sunflower seedling twist itself into a perfect question mark as it grows, you suspect the former. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the paranoia: sunflowers were banned not for what they did, but what they revealed. The infamous night whisper variety continued moving its leaves after dark, tracing patterns that matched courtiers' secret routes through the palace. The current chief of security shows you confiscated specimens pressed between obsidian sheets, their stems form perfect maps of hidden passages. "We executed 3 gardeners before realizing the flowers were the spies," he admits. Now for the quirky tidbit: the banishment created a thriving black market. You visit a sunflower speakeasy, where nobles pay to gaze at forbidden blooms in controlled environments. Today's feature is a dwarf variety bred to grow upside down, its roots coiled in a glass orb like botanical contraband. "It sings when watered with tears," claims the proprietor, though it sounds suspiciously like creaking wood to you. The real drama unfolds during the annual Sunflower Amnesty Day, when one brave soul petitions to reintroduce the flowers. This year's hopeful, a young astronomer, argues they're just plants reacting to light. His demonstration goes awry when his specimen immediately points toward the emperor's hidden escape tunnel instead of the ceremonial lamp. As guards drag him away, the flower somehow manages to look smug. As you leave, a child slips you a seed folded in a scrap of bark paper. "For your garden," she whispers. You don't have the heart to tell her it'll probably get you arrested. Still, you tuck it away. Some truths are worth cultivating, even in darkness. Ghost flowers. The deathbed chamber smells like incense and impending rain, a hush broken only by the rasping breaths of an old warrior and the occasional gasp as he describes blossoms no one else can see. "There, by the window," he whispers, skeletal finger trembling toward empty air. "The petals are the color of my first wife's laughter." The attending priest nods gravely, recording each detail in a ledger of floral hallucinations that's become the empire's most unsettling bestiary. This isn't just dying, it's gardening in the afterlife's waiting room. These spectral blooms, zoxypanili in the sacred texts, appear only to the dying, though descriptions vary wildly. A soldier sees battlefield lilies blooming from his wounds, a grandmother describes her mother's favorite violets floating near the ceiling, while a condemned thief insists the entire room has become a talking sunflower. Historians still argue whether these were deathbed visions, oxygen deprivation, or actual botanical ghosts, but watching a skeptical physician suddenly burst into tears because he smells father's pipe tobacco roses, you suspect the truth resists categorization. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the comfort. Aztec midwives placed specific flowers around newborns that matched those seen by dying relatives, creating a floral circle of life. The current death priest shows you a soul garden, where these paired blooms grow side by side, birth lilies tangled with death orchids in a continuum that somehow makes mortality feel less finite. We all enter and exit through petals, he murmurs, though this might just be professional poetry. Now for the quirky tidbit. The empire maintained a core of flower psychopomps who tried to harvest visions. You watch one such collector set up an elaborate trap involving silver mirrors and nectar bait near a dying baker's bed. When the man describes dough blossoms, the collector scrambles to sketch them, only for the baker to add they're also on fire, and singing rude songs about the emperor. The resulting painting hangs in the botanical archives labeled probably metaphorical. The real heartbreak unfolds in the Unclaimed Visions archive, descriptions from those who died alone. A child's final words about a puppy made of daisies. An unknown slave's murmured, "The cornflowers finally forgive me." The archivist touches each entry like it might bloom anew. They're not ghosts, she insists. Just flowers growing in directions we can't follow yet. As you leave, an apprentice presses a dried, dream petal into your palm, supposedly from a vision flower. That night, you swear it glows faintly as you sleep, though morning reveals it's just a common weed. Still, you tuck it into your journal, because some mysteries are worth preserving, even, or especially, the ones we imagine, the last garden. The conquered city smells like smoke and unexpected jasmine. Amid toppled temples and shattered pottery, a single-walled garden thrives with defiant persistence. You trace a finger along the cracked stucco where some quick-thinking gardener long ago mixed pulque into the mortar, creating a surface flowers cling to like survivors to a life raft. Inside, blossoms native and foreign grow in uneasy truce, Aztec marigolds elbowing Spanish roses for sunlight, medicinal vines climbing conquistador helmets repurposed as trellises. This isn't just horticulture, it's a floral insurgency where survival means hybridizing under duress. The keeper, an old man missing 2 fingers from pruning accidents, shows you the garden's secret, a buried irrigation system fed by broken aqueducts no one thought to dismantle completely. They took our gold, he whispers, but no one steals knowledge of how roots drink. Historians still argue whether these surviving gardens represent cultural preservation or just Spanish indifference to anything without military value, but watching the old man slip a forbidden chocolate flower seed into a child's palm, you know the answer. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the irony. The invaders' own crops failed until Aztec gardeners taught them companion planting. The current plot demonstrates this uneasy exchange. Maize grows in traditional milpa triangles around Old World wheat, while European bees bumble confusedly among native blossoms they can't quite pollinate. A friar's misplaced Bible sprouts mushrooms from its binding beside a still-flowering pre-conquest hymnbook pressed into service as a plant press. Now for the quirky tidbit, the garden became a covert language school. You watch children play, name that bloom, shouting terms in Nahuatl and Spanish while elders correct pronunciation through strategic weed pulling. A particularly clever girl points to a sunflower hybrid, Quitlaxicatl, she declares, then grins and adds, girasol, proving plants can have 2 names without splitting down the middle. The real magic happens at dusk, when the keeper performs his memory watering, reciting the names of lost flowers as he tends their surviving cousins. For the ghost orchids, he murmurs, sprinkling a patch of Spanish lavender. For the singing vines, pouring carefully at the base of a silent olive tree. The garden listens, and in the hush that follows, you swear you hear petals unfolding somewhere unseen. As you leave, the old man gifts you a single seed wrapped in a scrap of bark paper glyphs. Plant it with both names, he instructs. You don't have the heart to tell him you lack soil. But you tuck it into your pouch anyway, not because you believe it will grow, but because the act of carrying it feels like tending some vital, fragile thing the world tried to bury, modern chinampas. The canal shimmers with centuries-old ingenuity as your canoe glides past floating gardens still producing food as they did for Moctezuma's chefs. A farmer in rubber boots, a concession to modernity, gestures to the neat rectangular plots where corn, beans, and squash grow in the sacred triad, just as they did when conquistadors first gaped at their productivity. The old ways work, he shrugs, harvesting zucchini into a plastic crate while his son checks irrigation on a smartphone. This isn't just history preserved under glass, it's a 600-year-old agricultural revolution outproducing modern farms square foot for square foot, if you ignore the occasional floating candy wrapper. These surviving chinampas, now UNESCO protected, operate on the same principles: lake mud enriched with decaying plants, willows anchoring the edges, and flowers planted as natural pest control. A grandmother demonstrates the Three Sisters planting technique, her hands moving with the same motions shown in codices, though her sun hat sports a cartoon cactus. Historians still argue whether these methods could feed modern cities or just make excellent Instagram backdrops, but watching one farmer's tiny plot yield enough to supply 3 restaurants and a weekly market stall, you suspect the former. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the genius: chinampas yield 4 to 7 annual harvests compared to conventional farming's 1 to 2. The current caretaker explains how alternating crops with flowers prevent soil exhaustion. His grandfather's secret was marigolds, his father added poppies, and he's experimenting with edible nasturtiums that make the tomatoes taste less depressed. Nearby, a university researcher mutters into a voice recorder about mycorrhizal networks, while the farmer winks and whispers. The corn talks to the beans talk to the flowers, and none of them talk to him. Now for the quirky tidbit: the best chinampa soil comes from black gold, a compost made from invasive water hyacinths, fish guts, and the occasional rejected lucha libre mask fished from canals. You watch an apprentice layer this smelly treasure between reed mats while his mentor insists the secret ingredient is singing to it. Their duet of Cielito Lindo, with improvised lyrics about nitrogen cycles, suggests agricultural education has changed since the Aztec era. The real magic happens at the floating market, where gardeners sell produce from canoes just like their ancestors, albeit now accepting Venmo. A girl offers you a sample of ancestral blue corn tortillas from a solar-powered warmer, beside her abuela's more traditional como. Both taste like history, if history came with optional organic salsa. As sunset stains the canal's gold, a tour group's electric boat glides past a fisherman casting his net, the same throw his great-great-grandfather used, though now his catch gets tagged #sustainable seafood before hitting trendy bistros. As you leave, the farmer hands you a sprouting avocado pit wrapped in an ancient-looking leaf. Put it in water, talk to it about the weather, he advises. You realize it's less a gardening tip and more an invitation to continue what these floating gardens have always done: adapt, endure, and keep growing in unlikely places. Genetic mysteries. The laboratory smells like antiseptic and crushed hope. Sleek machines hum where clay pots once sat, their screens displaying DNA helix patterns that look suspiciously like the floral glyphs from stolen codices. You watch as a geneticist in a Flower Power t-shirt injects reconstructed ancient proteins into a petri dish, where a single listless tendril struggles to remember how to be extinct. We're close, she lies for the 15th time this hour, adjusting a microscope that magnifies failure to 400x. This isn't just botany, it's paleopoetry, where scientists play gods with test tubes and the flowers refuse to follow the script. The target species read like horticultural mythology: the golden song vine, that allegedly harmonized with dawn birdsong, the emperor's yawn blossom that put insomniac nobles to sleep, and the infamous ink orchid whose petals wrote poetry when brushed across paper. The lead researcher shows you their wall of maybe photos of flowers from surviving codices beside blurry electron microscope images. This could be the vascular pattern of the dream lily, he says, pointing to what looks like an ink blot. Historians still argue whether bringing back these plants constitutes restoration or grave robbery, but watching a lab tech whisper encouragement to a stubborn petri dish, you suspect both. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the challenge: less than 2% of Aztec flowers left viable seeds. The current breakthrough involves extracting DNA from 500-year-old pollen stains in the binding of a conquistador's diary. We've sequenced 87% of the chocolate flower genome, boasts a postdoc, then deflates when asked why their specimen smells like wet socks instead of cocoa. Across the room, an AI generates possible missing gene sequences. Its latest suggestion looks suspiciously like the Walmart logo. Now for the quirky tidbit. The lab's mascot is a zombie marigold, resurrected from seeds found in a 16th century rabbit fur pouch. It blooms in erratic bursts, once during a shareholder meeting, miraculous, and again directly into the department chair's coffee, less so. The researchers have learned not to mention how its petals form shapes resembling screaming faces when viewed under black light. The real drama unfolds in the hybrid nursery, where ancient genes meet modern plants. A Frankenstein's garden of blossoms with mismatched traits shivers under grow lights, a rose that thinks it's a cactus, prickly but fragrant, a lily that photosynthesizes through its petals, beautiful but starving, and the infamous, mumble tulip, that vibrates ominously when anyone mentions Spanish colonialism. The lead botanist strokes one mutated stem like a guilty parent. "We're learning," she says, as a flower across the room spontaneously combusts. As you leave, an intern hands you a vial labeled, maybe Zakiketzel's bloom, containing liquid and one floating speck. "Put it in moonlight," she whispers. You hold it up, the particle drifts left, then right, as if remembering how to be a seed. You tuck it away carefully. Some resurrections need more than science. They need someone who still believes in flowers that can sing, the Nezahualcóyotl effect. The poetry garden hums with murmured couplets. Each plant here survives because someone, centuries ago, loved it into immortality with metaphor. You trail fingers along a waist-high wall carved with floral odes, where modern visitors still press offerings of rhyme against the stone like botanical CPR. This isn't just horticulture, it's necromancy through iambic pentameter, where the right combination of syllables might coax a forgotten blossom back from oblivion's herbarium. The resurrected specimens read like living anthologies, the lover's lament, lily that only blooms when read 15th century breakup poems, the drunken bard, marigold that leans toward rhyming verse, and the infamous, critic's thorn, rose that wilts at clichés. The head poet gardener, her hands stained with ink and soil, demonstrates by whispering an epic to a shivering violet thought extinct until a 1990s grad student reconstructed its description from a warrior's love letter. Historians still argue whether these plants actually respond to poetry or just really committed academics, but watching a stubborn orchid finally unfurl during a particularly Saudi limerick, you suspect truth prefers ambiguity. Here's the mainstream fact that reveals the magic: Aztec nobility mandated poetic documentation of rare blooms. The current archivist shows you codices where flower descriptions flow in meticulous meter, not just science, but mnemonics set to rhythm. You remember the jade petals clasped like praying hands better than "plant has green flowers," she shrugs, proving her point by reciting a 500-year-old verse that makes your palms itch for non-existent pollen. Now for the quirky tidbit: the garden hosts competitive resurrection tournaments where poets attempt to revive lost species through verse alone. Today's challenger sweats through a sonnet to the mythical moon gulper vine while judges watch for sprouts. When nothing happens, an elderly spectator shouts, "Try the dirty version," and indeed, a decidedly risque haiku about pollination coaxes up a single suspicious tendril that may just be a weed with performance anxiety. The real miracle grows in plot 42, the orphan blooms, plants whose original names and uses are lost, kept alive by rotating volunteers who improvise new poems daily. A child lisps a made-up song to a shy blue flower, and damn if it doesn't perk up slightly, as if grateful someone finally tried. The head gardener catches your skeptical look. "We don't know if it's the words or the care," she admits. "But does it matter, if they live?" As you leave, the archivist presses a seed packet into your hand. Inside, 3 dark specks and a scrap with handwritten couplets. "Recite while planting," she instructs. You don't ask what species it is. Some mysteries grow better without labels. Floral time capsules. The conservation lab smells like salt and stubborn hope. Archivists in blue gloves peer at seeds that spent centuries sleeping in sunken hulls, their stories preserved in brine and darkness. You watch as a researcher brushes sediment from a walnut-sized pod that last saw sunlight when Montezuma still ruled, its surface etched with patterns that match no known living plant. This one was somebody's treasure, she murmurs, placing it in a tray labeled dreams that didn't drown. This isn't just archaeology, it's high-stakes gardening with the past, where every cracked shell might hold a world lost to conquest. The recovery process is equal parts science and seance. Seeds are interviewed with humidity scans and X-rays before their slow awakening in agar baths that mimic ancestral soils. The current star patient, a lima bean from a 1524 shipwreck, has sprouted leaves unlike any modern variety, their veins forming glyph-like patterns that make botanists whisper behind clipboards. Historians still argue whether these resurrected plants deserve museum display or farmland, but watching an elderly farmer weep as he touches a leaf from a squash thought extinct since his great-grandfather's time, you suspect the answer is yes. Here's the mainstream fact that chills. Many seeds were packaged for intentional preservation, stored in beeswax-lined gourds with careful instructions scratched onto accompanying copper plates. The head conservator shows you one such message, translated from a long-dead gardener's hand: when the world burns, plant us sideways and sing. Nearby, a successfully germinated amaranth grows in a reconstruction of its original soil mix, its purple leaves startlingly vibrant against the sterile lab. We think it's the sing part that actually matters, admits a technician, humming as she waters it. Now for the quirky tidbit. The project employs historical taste testers who sample resurrected crops after thorough toxicology screening. Today's volunteer chews a sliver of 16th century tomato and immediately starts scribbling flavor notes: smoky, sweet like roasted peppers, makes my molars tingle. His colleague nibbling a revived chili variety requires milk and a signed waiver before continuing. Across the room, a chef experiments with lost bean tamales that may soon grace high-end menus, assuming the beans stop giving everyone strangely prophetic dreams. The real drama unfolds in the mystery section, seeds too damaged for immediate identification, each tagged with their ship's fate. A intern excitedly matches a shriveled pod to a codex illustration of the dreamer's vine, only to grow zucchini. The conservator sighs. History loves practical jokes. Meanwhile, the actual dreamer's vine seeds sit mislabeled as probable weeds, until a visiting poet recognizes their description from an erotic epic and blushes furiously. As you leave, a researcher slips you a tiny vial containing 3 unassuming specks, from the maybe chocolate wreck. You cradle it like the hope it is, that some pleasures aren't lost, just waiting beneath tides and time to bloom again, the language revival. The research greenhouse thrums with tension, linguists clutching codex photocopies glare at botanists mouthing plant Latin, both groups united only by their shared frustration with flowers that refuse to follow ancient scripts. You watch as a grad student adjusts electrodes on a hibiscus stem, desperately hoping to capture some botanical Morse code. It's like decoding a joke where the punchline only works if you're photosynthetic, groans her advisor. This isn't just scholarship, it's cross-species diplomacy where the other party communicates in wilts, blooms, and suspiciously timed pollen releases. The team's Rosetta Stone is a crumbling, flower speech codex showing blossoms arranged in grammatical structures, petal count indicating verb tense, fragrance intensity as adjectives. The lead researcher, wearing a "talk dirty to me" in Aztec florography pin, demonstrates by presenting a marigold with 3 possible sentences. The plant responds to "the emperor is generous" by shedding petals, to "your pollen is attractive" with a subtle perfume increase, and to "we have fertilizer" with what can only be described as a vegetative happy dance. Historians still argue whether these were trained responses or wishful thinking, but watching a cactus spine twitch in perfect sync with a recited poem, you're inclined to believe the Aztecs knew things about plant communication we're just rediscovering. Here's the mainstream fact that humbles. Modern experiments prove plants do react differently to tonal patterns. The lab's voice box plays recorded nahuatl at frequencies matching bee-wing vibrations, resulting in a 20% faster bloom rate versus modern Spanish. A skeptical biologist scoffs until his control group of English-spoken plants grows noticeably lopsided away from the sound source. Okay, maybe they're racist, he concedes, earning a withering look from the marigolds. Now for the quirky tidbit. The project's mascot is a bilingual sunflower, trained to tilt toward compliments in either language. It develops a concerning preference for Italian love sonnets, often ignoring research commands to bask in romantic recitations. The undergrad assigned to whisper sweet nothings has started receiving bouquets from unexplained admirers. The real breakthrough comes from an unexpected source: elderly market vendors who never stopped using fragments of the flower language. You witness a florist scold a drooping orchid with phrases from the codices. The plant perks up within minutes, though this may just be terror. Nearby, a grandmother teaches her granddaughter to ask properly for cuttings by offering honey and reciting a petal counting rhyme. The resulting blooms last 3 weeks longer than the control group. Science frowns. Tradition smirks. As you leave, the lead researcher hands you a starter lexicon, common phrases with floral responses. Try "your roots are glorious on stubborn houseplants," she suggests. That night, your wilted peace lily noticeably greens after the compliment, though this could absolutely be coincidence. You keep whispering to it anyway, because some conversations don't need translation to matter. Moonlight harvest. The garden at night is a different kingdom. Shadows soften the strict geometry of beds, and blossoms that shun the sun finally unfurl their secrets. You walk paths silvered by moonlight, your steps slower now, breathing in the drowsy perfume of flowers that know the day's scrutiny has passed. This isn't just a garden anymore, it's a living lullaby, each rustling leaf a whisper saying rest, rest, the world will keep growing without your watching. The flowers here remember what we've forgotten: how to be still, how to drink starlight, how to measure time in unfurling rather than hours. A night-blooming cereus sighs open beside you, its brief glory timed to no human schedule. Somewhere, an exhausted gardener sleeps with soil still under his nails, trusting the earth to tend itself a while. Historians will argue forever about what the Aztecs truly knew of flowers, but tonight, that feels like missing the point entirely. The truth is here in the dark, simpler and stranger. We planted, they grew, and somewhere between the two, we made meaning together. The night air carries the last notes of floral perfumes, now fading, now gone, as the garden settles into itself. You've walked among emperors and farmers, through wars waged with petals and rebellions rooted in stubborn soil. The blossoms have told their stories, the historians will keep arguing, and you, dear listener, have been the perfect companion through it all. As the final flowers close their eyes, know this: every seed you've gathered on our journey, whether literal or metaphorical, contains a world waiting to unfold. Plant them when ready. Speak to them often. And when the world feels too heavy, remember even the mightiest empires found solace in the quiet rebellion of things that grow. Now, let the last images drift like petals on water, a floating garden's reflection, a bee's drowsy flight home, the gentle closing of a flower that's done its work. The dark is kind. The earth remembers. And tomorrow, always, there will be more blossoms.
Thank you so much for listening to tonight's story. If you enjoyed this gentle journey through the past, we'd love it if you gave the video a like and subscribe to the Dozing Historian. It helps us keep making cozy, sleepy history content, and you'll be the first to know when a new episode drifts in. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time.